OG Yuffie or remake Yuffie?
Whatever Yuffie I had in my head.
That's not the question.
Whatever. Welcome everybody to yet another Ultima Talk stream. Today, I have the man, the myth, the legend, Sleepezi. You may know this guy from his multiple feature-length Final Fantasy VII Remake theory videos on YouTube. One of the recent ones, which has like blown up. It's like beyond like 250,000 views now. It's almost like 300,000, right?
Yeah, it's on its way, which is weird because that video came out so long ago, and for some reason, I don't know if it's just because of all the Final Fantasy VII news, but it's just been, it's having a second life right now. So
yeah, I'm seeing that. Like it keeps getting pushed up on my algorithm like all the time. It's like, oh yo, and I'm like, dude,
sorry about that.
No. I've watched the whole video twice. For everyone who does,
shit.
Yes, I've watched the whole video twice. The first time I watched it, actually, I was at the gym, and that's like when it first dropped. I was like kind of like listening to it more so at the gym, like when I was working out, because I was like, this is a long video. This is how like I tend to get through like podcasts and other stuff. So I was like, I'll do it like that, right? And then like maybe shortly before I did like my second playthrough, my second evaluation playthrough of Remake. I did, for those of you who've been following us here on Twitch and know what that's been like. I watched it again right before then, and so I'm pretty familiar with it. It's a fantastic video, so if anyone's watching this and has not seen it after this stream, you definitely need to go check it out. Fantastically done. Just as like a content creator, as like an editor, you are godly, bro. Like just godly. Like your work is incredible. Is there anything you want to add to like your introduction before we move on?
Sure.
About
yeah,
like what you do.
As NSP said, I'm a content creator for Final Fantasy VII Remake. I have a new video in the works currently on a sort of re-examination of Intergrade, or specifically Intermission, coming out, talking about some of my favorite elements of that DLC. Mainly just some of like the more like intricate and sort of some deep cut compilation stuff that they included, not like the deep ground stuff, but some of the Avalanche stuff. I'm really excited about that, and got just a number of videos coming out. And if you guys want to watch a Final Fantasy VII OG playthrough, we're going through that right now on my Twitch channel. And we're talking about like Remake, we're talking about the compilation, we're talking about just like, and also kind of doing like a compare and contrast, I think, which is something that's kind of been long overdue for me, is kind of looking at the pacing of the original game and sort of looking at what it does really well and what it like the remake does really well, or like what one has over the other, or where they both kind of like meet in the middle, or replace something completely, and just sort of see whether that's good or bad. So it's a fun time. So if you guys want to do that, I do that at like 5 p.m. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later, every day this of the week now. And we're on like day 3, and we've only gotten we just got to the start of the second bombing run, so that's how slow we move. We got a lot to talk about. So
this is like a long, this is like Tim Rogers type stuff where you like
you
go through
gotta look
long analyzation of everything.
Yeah, dude.
I love that type of stuff though. I really do. I think most of your audience loves long form content, especially too, because all your videos are quite meaty, which that's like the perfect fuel for like I love like returning to a long video, like whenever I eat dinner or like go to the gym. I'm like, oh yeah, I get to continue my video. That's what your videos are like perfect for. That's how I binge like a good chunk of all your stuff. And
I enjoy that sort of format too, just in general. Like before I made content myself, I relied on those videos to get through a day most of the time when I would be working or anything like that, or working on like my own projects. I'd be like in a parking lot being like, okay, like this video. Tim Rogers is people I mentioned, as you mentioned and Chad is mentioning, is like one of those people who has like, oh, this is like exactly what I need. Just somebody who's like willing to sit down and make like a 5-hour long video.
Yeah.
Just to get me through a day.
Yeah.
So.
I love it. I love it too. Especially great for people with desk jobs. But and also for anyone who's also coming in from Sleepezi's side, I'm the Night Sky Prince. For those who are curious on me and like what I've done for Remake, leading up to the launch of Remake, and for years even before leading up to the launch of Remake, I was pumping out videos for this game. At one point, I was actually making like a video a day about the game. And unfortunately, after release, and even with subsequent playthroughs, I'm not a hater, but you could definitely consider me one of Remake's skeptics. I am not on board currently with the story that they're presenting. I really do enjoy the game. I think it's a fantastic game. From like a game design perspective, it is a really fun game to play. In fact, that's why I've been going back through the Intergrade version right now. As an action RPG, I think it has like one of the best combat systems in any JRPG I have ever played, Final Fantasy or otherwise. I think they absolutely nailed the combat there. I think it's just really, really fun and enjoyable. But story-wise, I have a number of concerns and criticisms of the first part and where they'll be going in the future, right? And I don't think I'm the only skeptic per se, but I think that those who are skeptical but optimistic do tend to look sort of at the theory crafting community to, you know, kind of help them decide where they land and like how they feel and how the story could still end up satisfying them. And I think that's what's interesting about you, right? Because a lot of people like where your theories are headed and how they tend to maintain like a lot of the themes like of Final Fantasy VII, right? Like because potentially now with Zack back alive, a lot of people are worried about like how those themes that really made them connect to the original Final Fantasy VII may be lost within this remake, sequel, reboot, reimagining, rebuild. So
that's a really solid way of addressing exactly why I'm more on the side of just like really enjoying myself with Remake, maybe as opposed to somebody who's a little bit more skeptical. Is that the one thing I would say about Final Fantasy VII Remake is that the one thing I do not question right now are the themes. I do not question that at all. I think that's actually the one thing that has probably been the least messed with in terms of the overall story, just because there wasn't like a hard death in it, which I know is also something that kind of comes up with this. People tend to point at that, but I would mainly disagree with that in terms of just what the central idea of Final Fantasy VII is trying to like did and what this one is trying to preserve. And as far as I get the idea of being freaked the fuck out over Zack being alive.
Yeah.
I totally get that. I think that fear and where that's going is supposed to do exactly what we're talking about, or what we're feeling about it, which is like you're like gonna be completely thrown off like your radar. Like what on earth are they gonna do with this? Exactly, Sir Sonic. Zack is alive. Yeah. So that in particular, and I think this is something that, so I've actually been watching a lot of your streams recently, and I really think that you have generated probably some of the best discussion around this game since for a very long time. Like, and I'm talking specifically on like Twitch. Like you're constantly engaging like the chat, even though you might not have like an opinion that totally aligns with every other person who you're talking to. It's sort of pressing them to sort of like, what is it about this game that like is so central to like why you like it, and like I need you to explain that. And like you obviously are very good at articulating like your stance on it, and it's one of the reasons why it's so easy to watch you. But just it was just super fun for me to look at all of these people's perspectives, because I tend to get a certain type of audience where we're all kind of in agreement that like we're very open to what's about to happen. You know, we're not like super, you know, taken off guard by anything new that's happening. There's a lot that we're just willing to kind of go in blind and be okay with that, as well as just theory crafting and just enjoying the ride and maybe like trying to figure out what's going to happen next. That's where we sit, but we hardly get anybody in like a chat where it's like, this game is just like, ugh, and you know, like there's no, you know. So me kind of being a wallflower on your streams has been an interesting experience, just because it sort of allowed me to help me like define my opinion a bit more, in terms of like how and it's also just this way of like looking at the community and their viewpoints on it and why they like it and why they dislike it. I think one of the things that came up in your stream is that I was like heavily concerned about like both the people who were criticizing it, not necessarily you, just seeing like what people were thinking about it. It was concerning me looking at what people's criticisms were of the game as it is now. And then it also concerned me over the people who were liking the game, not necessarily being able to like see maybe that like, even if it doesn't happen, right? But like a lot of people will argue the Zack is alive or dead thing, even if they like the direction of the game that this is going in, which I think is slightly something that needs to be addressed. Yeah. And I literally had to take charge of that conversation in my chat, because I was like, oh my God, people aren't like, if this happens, like people are going to be taken off guard, and they're like, I think it's a weird perspective, right? Like people have this idea that this remake is going to be exactly what they want it to be. Yeah. Right. Yeah. In their mind's eye. Some people, I'm not going to generalize and say everybody, but I've seen a lot of that discussion being like, this is what they're like, I think this is what's going to happen. It's sort of the same thing with the remake is that maybe you're expecting something that might not happen. And if it doesn't, are you going to be really disappointed by it? Like if Zack is alive, how many people are going to like jump ship, right? Yeah. Like immediately, the people who have been supporting it. So like, as of like right now, I think that's where the central conversation of this game is for me, is like trying to get people in the mindset of just like, look, no, actually like nobody knows what's going to happen. Yeah. And that's the whole point of the ending of the game. Right. Is that they wanted to prove to you that they could do the characters right, that they could tell a very visually interesting story with these characters that you love and not f*** up the characters. Right. I mean, more specifically. Right. And then prepare you to choose whether or not you want to buy part 2 or not. The test of time is the final boss of part 1. It's just like, if you can't get down with this, if you can't get down with Zack being alive or fighting the future or just addressing that, then this is your ticket off if you want it to be. You know what I mean? Right. So and that's like, I think that's like a huge point to like realize too, right? Because the end of the game ends with the unknown journey will continue. And I've seen more than just a few people be like, well, you know, the unknown journey means that like it's unknown to the people who haven't played before, or it's unknown to the characters or something along those lines. But I'm like, I think when they say the unknown journey will continue, they really mean the unknown journey, the journey that none of you know is right. Going to continue, right? Because it doesn't say the unknown journey will continue for, you know, this audience, or the unknown journey will continue for the characters, right? I think it's a message for everybody, right? Because it doesn't make it doesn't make sense to be like the game to leave off on a message like that only for like a maybe like niche audience of like their total demographic, right?
And I think that also they're aware too that a lot of people are, kind of experiencing Final Fantasy VII for the first time, and I think it's just, it means like an unknown journey for everyone, because quite frankly, with the way these twists are going, no one really knows where exactly any of this is going. We have ideas, we have very educated guesses, but no one's like definitively able to say that like, it's going here. And
you brought up a really, really good point, I think. And it's something that I've come across a lot, because I have a film background. So I've studied film for like 5 years and have been around a lot of different kinds of artists who have a lot of very specific tastes and a lot of opinions. And some of those are sort of like the group speak, like something is popular just by the fact that everybody likes it. And then there's the like people who just really have like this hardened opinion about like what is good, what is bad, and something that might be praised could be something that is not for them. So, and that's what the pool of any piece of art is like, you have the people who are sort of either like just gung-ho about it because there's sort of like this larger like following behind it, and a lot of like it's like the now and you're really into it. And it just sort of fades away after that. But for me, like one of the things that I think I want to say, I feel like I was slightly ignorant to this fact, because I thought I was going to be the odd man out of Remake. I thought people were going to fucking hate the game after I saw it and played it. I was like, there's no way that everyone's going to be on board with this. And weirdly enough, it ended up being like this sort of, I want to say it's 50-50. I would almost even say that there's almost more support for it than
I would say 90-10. I would say 90% support what's going on, or they're not like offended enough by it, or they're not bothered enough by it to go away.
Right. Yeah. So I'm going to say that it is more divisive than I think we both know the game is more divisive than the public might think it is. Right. So because one of the things for me, I'll speak for myself, that's how I feel about it, is because that ending is not supposed to give you a sense of comfort at all. Right. That unsettling feeling of that art is not supposed to be like, like you're supposed to be like, oh shit, this can completely go into the ground. And the developers taking that off, and it's commendable, and you can sit there and be like, that's a really cool idea, but the reality of the situation is that they did that specifically to make you feel uncomfortable as fuck. There's not a single bone in that body that is I'm not supposed to be sitting here feeling extra confident about like the direction of this game. No one is. Right. And I think that's where it started to scare me, because everyone was super on board with the game. It is super on board with the game. But I think that they've chosen not to actually take the full brunt of that emotion, that feeling that the game is giving off. I think that there's a lot of slipping and sliding around the point in certain instances. Which scares me, because again, it's sort of making me feel like people might be hyping themselves up for something that they don't actually want. So, and as soon as it becomes solidified, that might not be the case anymore. They might really hate it. Right. It's not what they wanted it to be. And the idea is to not expect or know or be able to tell what you're getting. And then being able to play it and see and just experience it for the first time, right? Which I'm now super on board with. Like, I will say this is like, a lot of people look to me as like the lore guy, the theory crafter for Final Fantasy VII Remake. If you go back and watch my first video, I specifically make a joke about how I will never talk about the Zack thing. And I broke that obviously in my last video, because it's been like a year and a half of me kind of thinking about it off and on. But I realistically looking back, the reason I didn't address it is because I kind of was just like, that is such a wild card. Nobody would be able to tell, like, I wouldn't be able to say anything confidently enough to be able to tell you where that's going to go. Right. Because nobody should. And that's exactly what it's designed to do. It's supposed to be impervious to the guests, to the assumption of what this part of the game is going to do to people.
Exactly.
So yeah, in my mind, this game is both like, I think Remake did exactly what it wanted to do. And I think that gives me a little bit more confidence in it. For people who might be like wondering if I'm like hating on the game all of a sudden, I'm not. I actually am more into the game now than I ever have been, because I think they knew exactly what they were doing and what they were calling their shot on. And they did everybody the service of, because a lot of people even criticize the game for being abrasive in tone by the end of the game. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Like everybody is like, that ending is so fucking weird. And the tone shifts completely. And the point of that scene is to be abrasive and fast moving and just start throwing you everything that is not what you think this game is going to be. Right. It's literally complete. It's not like it's subversion, but more like water and oil. It's like, here's the new, and we're not going to be apologetic about it at all. And you're needing to experience this, because if you go forward from here expecting anything else, you're going to be disappointed. You're going to be disappointed if you don't think that there's more after this that is just this. You know what I mean? Right. So for me, that's where I'm interested, is that I'm personally willing to be wrong about everything I've ever said about the game. And like, I obviously have spent like hours and hours and hours and days of my life kind of looking at this game and there are things that I feel very strongly about that I think are directions that the game will go in. But there is that other half of it that I'm super willing to just be wrong about it and not know and experience it for the first time. And I think that's the best thing, honestly, in my opinion, for everybody for this remake. I think everybody really should just be really stoked to see these characters go through something new and different. And I'm super willing to do that, because that's the one part of Remake that like so proved itself to me while playing it. Like, I want to fucking spend more time with the characters just as they are. And that was kind of the excuse for playing the remake to begin with. It's like, I want to play and see Cloud more. I want to play Barrett and see more of him. And like, the game delivered on that like 110%. So it's like, that was the selling point for the remake for me to begin with. And now I'm getting more of it, and maybe even something new with all of that. Right. Which is really cool.
And to that point, actually, like, you know, when someone asked me if I think Remake was a divisive game or not, I always say no, it wasn't. It was overwhelmingly well received. Remake itself is not a divisive game, part one. The way I always perceived it is that the game itself is not divisive, but I think it could have set itself up for a very divisive future. And I think that's actually the point that I don't think that most people like really realize, right? Because if you talk about Remake Part 1 in a macro, everyone will agree that it's a phenomenal story. But when you actually start talking about where certain plot threads are going to go, that's where, like, if you like poll communities on it, I pulled mine, I've seen polls from others, that's where things start to get really contentious, right? Like, if you talk about, say, Zack being alive, right? I ran a poll once, like, on, like, are you excited for Zack to be alive in Remake? And it was something like 1/3 of the audience said yes, the other third of the audience said no, and the other third of the audience was, like, undecided. And so it's like,
I think undecided is the best option out of all of those.
Yeah, and it is, right?
That's important.
Those are the people, also, right, who probably will have the best time too, right?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly where, because you're not supposed, like, I like, again, coming from my background of like really in like dedicating myself to Remake, I'm the most unsure about Zack in terms of like how he will be used, in terms of like how I will feel about him in the story. But I'm also extremely open to the fact that like this is not going to be the game that I think people that I was expecting when I first played it, you know? Right. And that's fine. I think that's where I'm trusting in it in only the sense that they have handled all their characters up until this point with a lot of like dignity. They've proven to sort of put these characters into situations that like really like that's always the hardest thing to get right for me. And out of any story I've ever seen, played, whatever, read, like if you can't sell me on the character, we don't have a game or we don't have a story. Right. You know what I mean? Is that a lot of characters are used as devices to get through a story or to tell like a thematically relevant story. I would say that the compilation is the best example of stories that are told from the perspective of we're just telling a story. We're not really telling like a character-driven sort of engaging kind of story. Like Before Crisis is just dialogue coming out of people's mouths most of the time just to get to the next thing. And all of it is obviously written under the mindset that they're trying to deliver you like some sort of thematically relevant thing to Final Fantasy VII, whether that's like an environmental message or like what it is. Like Destiny is a huge aspect of like the compilation that is very relevant in Remake. But the thing that they never get right, in my opinion, or why those games aren't considered very good at all by most people, is they don't focus on those characters. And that was the one thing that immediately was settled as soon as I started playing Remake. It's like, even while I'm fighting a boss, like these characters are fucking like laying into each other, like shitting on each other.
Yeah, the dialogue is
like
great,
just having a really good time. So, and that's the way to do it, because like you said, like those boss battles are something to behold. In general, the combat of the game is amazing.
For sure.
So to be able to tell a story through just all of the events that are going on is really cool. Just the whole way that they decided to have like banter even in like Midgar was like a really interesting experience, because it feels kind of lived in, and like these people are actually like here kind of doing this thing. So I agree very strongly on the characters, and I think like most of my contention with the game isn't necessarily the characters themselves, but the macro way in which they execute the plot is where I start to find like a lot of my issues, specifically on the Arbiters. Because one thing that I started to think about, and we kind of discussed this while I was streaming, but now that I have you here, I have your face, I have your voice. I actually do want to ask you about this, because it's something that, like, the argument has been kind of that the Arbiters are inconsistent, right? Like that has been like a huge argument against the Arbiters, is that the way they work is not consistent. And when I started like playing through the game, what I really thought of is that, do the Arbiters see all timelines, or do they only see the one they're trying to preserve? Essentially, are they viewing time from the perspective of Doctor Strange, or are they viewing time from the perspective of like future Trunks? That's, you know, what's really funny to me is that I've heard this argument brought up, and it did, and like you said, it sort of was something that was brought up in your stream. I personally have no idea what anybody is talking about when they bring that up, because I missed something in terms of
would you like an example of what I mean?
Would like an example. You know what, really quickly, I hate to do this on stream, but I need to take a very quick second.
Oh, he's back. Okay. He's back.
Sorry about that, guys.
Okay. So let me explain what I mean by or why I think it matters, like that question. It may seem superfluous at first, but I assure you it's not, because if you think about it,
I'm willing.
It kind of determines their level of consistency, right? Say for example, when Hojo was about to spill the beans with Cloud not being in Soldier, right? So like, first of all, I guess, how would that even diverge in the first place, thinking on it? But then also, to the point, it's sort of like, did they like have to like, why did they have to like wait for him to go that far where he basically already says the thing that would already diverge the timeline? And another example would be like Leslie pointing a gun at Corneo's head. there'd be no way for the Arbiters to actually stop him, right? So it would make sense if the Arbiters, say like Doctor Strange, were able to see all points in time and know that Leslie would not pull that gun. But if they only are seeing the timeline in which they're which they're to preserve, then theoretically they shouldn't allow any deviation because they don't know how exactly that would impact it, right? So they wouldn't even have let Leslie hold that gun to Corneo's head because they wouldn't be able to tell what implications that would have on achieving their timeline. So I'm under the understanding that they're able to perceive all points in time at once, right? Does that make sense?
I'm going to start. Yeah, I get sort of where this is going, and I think I'll start with the example first of the one example presented and one of the ones in chat, and I'm gonna then work my way backwards to just sort of like how in general Final Fantasy VII has portrayed their world systems, especially their defense systems in the past. Is that with the Don Corneo thing, it's explained in some Ultimania that like the only reason that certain people can see these things or not interact, but just like there are characters that are very core to the ability of changing destiny, like that they are key to this. And if they are, then if they begin to deviate, they need to be set back into place, or the timeline needs to be set back in place, which is why Rufus is one of those characters, because he has a huge impact on the overall direction of how things play out to sort of get to, as we know, Advent Children. Like those events need Rufus in place in doing what he needs to do up until the point where that future sort of becomes a reality, which is what the Arbiters are focused on, is that they are focused on keeping the timeline moving towards an Advent Children outcome. So whether or not Leslie is going to do something is almost inconsequential because he doesn't have that effect seemingly on that moment, or there isn't any threat of this moment actually deviating. Whereas like every character like Barrett, Cloud, and all of these characters have become sort of self-aware to a point where they are the ones now able to see them, which it has something to do with the fact that they have a huge impact on destiny. But they sort of are looking at, now that they're seeing like the man behind the curtain, so to speak, they're a problem. They're now a problem because now they're aware, they're making decisions that they probably wouldn't have made if they hadn't seen them. But now that they do, like they're slowly taking things further and further off the rails. That's sort of the implication of it's like if you were aware of what you were going to do tomorrow, and you just the presence of that knowledge is going to maybe affect the outcome of it. But if you had to do everything accurately, what if you're nervous and you drop your cup? Oh God, and now I don't have my coffee and now I'm going to not get to work on time. And then it just becomes this butterfly effect of events to be like sort of, I hope that's a reasonable enough explanation.
No, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense.
On top of that, the other thing about an inconsistency, or just like how instantaneously the world reacts to this sort of threat, this imminent threat of everything going to is literally embodied by just the world defense systems of any other Final Fantasy VII game. And I would say the weapons are a perfect example, is that they're like white blood cells. And as we know, white blood cells are not not the smartest things on the planet. They can attack things that are actually good for the planet. They can ignore the actual problem and make matters worse in the body because they're just reactionary. They are literally only activated due to a threat, and that's it. It's not the planet like consciously knowing that this is going to happen. They are literally like a knee-jerk reaction to Meteor being summoned. That's the only reason they show up. And it was the only reason that they actually like were being created to begin with, is because Genova was getting so out of hand that the live stream started to literally manifest these weapons to try and combat her, and then they were just put to sleep because they weren't even used because they weren't made fast enough, and the Cetra took care of them to begin with. So the planet isn't like God, like at the snap of a finger, like Thanos, where they just snap their finger and the threat immediately vanishes.
Right, of course.
You know what I mean?
Otherwise, they get rid of Shinra, right?
Right, exactly. It's like there's no threat in that, and looking at the whole planet, and this is how I look at like the spiritual aspect of Final Fantasy VII, and just like and made into the physical sort of reality of this awesome fantasy world is that it very much operates like a body. And that's sort of what Geostigma is. That's sort of what Genova is she's like the physical manifestation of like a lot of like both mental illness and also physical diseases. Like she's a perfect manifestation of all of that to both the planet and to like the way that she interacts with and changes the perspective of characters just inherently. Just because of she also is just driven by this innate desire to just like animal instincts almost. She's just instinctive, which is essentially just how the whole planet operates.
Right.
So the whole world of Final Fantasy VII is this world of this instinctive way of moving towards something. So it's not operating perfectly. It's just operating on instinctive behavior. So the same thing with Whispers is when something happens, they are triggered. An event must trigger the Whispers to show up. They do not instinctively, I don't even look at like the weapons as having like much of their own thoughts or feelings. They just are very responsive. Like the life stream in Mediel starts to act up, right? And then the weapon shows up in Mediel. Right. So it's not the life stream reacts to the weapon, it's the weapon reacting to the life stream. Right. And that's just how everything flat out works. So to question how effective the world system is how Final Fantasy VII framed its own weapon system in the past. So I don't think that we're supposed to look at Whispers as these infallible sort of mechanics. Right. It's just how everything has already been. Right. Sort of, if that makes sense.
Right. I guess what I was really asking more so was like, what exactly triggers them to show up in a sense, or how they would be able to determine that deviation is like the mechanism in which they would use to determine that deviation, right? Because that's what kind of bothers me about their appearances is because there doesn't seem to be too much of that, right? And then like determining who sees them, of course, like you said, like if you know about the presence of them, then at some point that can cause a deviation in itself. But then you have, Rufus who can know about them, but then like Reno can't. And Reno definitely has a big influence on the plot. And then Yuffie, of course, isn't able to see them yet. And then, yes. Right.
I think that's the easiest way to look at that too, because I know that was sort of brought up as well, is that there is like a different sort of form of time clearly with like how this one is. But to answer like your question more directly, where it's like how do they act instinctively or what exactly is the thing that like they respond to, which is just the closest that it rides to or something that they can fix minorly of a deviation in the plot is what triggers them. Anything that is about to go against the Advent Children outcome of something, or if they can redirect something, they do. So like in the instance of Jessie, they don't need to kill Jessie or do anything to Jessie. They just need to make sure that she isn't the one who goes on the mission, because that's not what's supposed to happen. Cloud is supposed to go on that mission so he can fall from the plate to meet Aerith, and then Aerith and Cloud need to get out of the church. She can't be seized by Shinra, not yet. We need to allow all of these things to happen. So the characters are all acting the way that they would in a situation. It's one of the things that's really key about that Cloud in the church moment, where he actually is going to kill Reno. He's going to straight up like cut Reno in half, and the Whispers are like, you shouldn't do that. So here's the thing is that that's a pretty clear distinction between what the character wants to do and what the Whispers are trying to protect. Is like, so Reno is important to the plot in some regard, but he's like not somebody who has complete autonomy over like the course of events. Like maybe we could get there without him. He's not like a necessary pawn, but he's one piece of something. But Rufus, for instance, has like so much. He's in command of the Turks. He's like doing a puppet show to like all of Shinra. Like it's that sort of mentality is like, that's sort of how I see it, at least.
Right. And I think that makes sense. I guess part of my contention with it is just sort of like, in a weird manner, determining who is influential enough to just like be able to like influence the future in that regard, if that makes sense. But I suppose in this case, it's neither here nor there. But one of my bigger questions, I guess like one of, and because this kind of like leads into like my next topic. So actually, if you had something you want to say there, please feel free before I kind of segue into what I was going to do.
No, I was going to say that's probably like the easiest way to like sort of sum up that whole thing is just like who is sort of deemed as important and who is not is just simply through the way that the game is telling you. And they'll probably give you more of a reason to feel like, oh, that's why.
Yeah, in part 2, right? Yeah.
Is when maybe one of them goes missing or is gone from the plot and then things completely deviate. Then you'll know, oh, well, that's probably why the Whispers.
Right.
So this shit didn't happen.
Right.
Like, what if what if Rufus gets killed? And then it's like, okay, well, maybe the Sister Ray call never, like, they never bring the ray over to Midgar, and then they never have like the gun to fire it, or maybe it just is so off the rails at that point. I'm just saying, it's just such a weird way, like that the game can go if you just take one of those characters out. I could see Reno being gone and then just another Turk there. Yeah. I know that he is a personality that people care about, right? And like he's somebody that we know. But if you just like, even in Before Crisis, there's like fucking 24 of them that are all willing to do the same thing, right? That Reno is doing, and they all follow the same orders. Yeah. So
yeah, you have to have at least 100,000 followers in order to see the Arbiters.
That's right. You know what? Actually,
that's when you're influential enough.
To that point, and one of the things that I think the Whispers represent pretty clearly is like, are you somebody who's willing to change the course of something? Whether that's in the bounds of societal sort of norms, or like what you're planning on doing. Like, are you planning on going against what you think is wrong, even though like that might seem like an unstoppable force? So like Rufus is a character that I would say fits into the category of somebody who would actually go against something that is like embedded into society. It's sort of like, and this is what I always use the example of whenever I'm describing why I think this whole Destiny talk is like actually perfectly in line with the original sort of thematic structure of like Final Fantasy VII, is that the idea of getting off of the rails is supposed to be like this horrifying concept, because like in Midgar, the entire city is powered by this energy, right? And the president, upon being confronted by Barrett being like, you're David and Goliath and we're gonna stop you, and then he essentially just lays it out for Barrett, and he's like, okay, well, you want to be in charge, essentially? You want to see what happens when the lights turn off and people like don't have any support system, and like, how are they gonna feel about that? They're not gonna thank you for doing anything.
Right, exactly.
They're gonna actively fight you against that. Like, people are so convinced that this is the right thing to do, or that they're so comfortable in this way of thinking that you doing this is going to literally, like, you think you're doing the right thing, but really what you're going to do is like uproot every sort of societal pillar that we've created, and now you're going to have to replace it in some way, and you don't have the answer to that. And so he pretty much tells Barrett that he's full of shit, and he's kind of right. I'm going to say it. Like, I think he's kind of right, is that he's not ready, because again, the outcome of Barrett is, I'm going to go look for fossil fuels. It's like, that's his eventual destiny, is to do something. He doesn't end up becoming a leader at all. You know what I mean? He just ends up going and doing his own thing. So my point is just to say that like those are the characters that the Arbiters sort of fixate on, is the characters that will do that will uproot this, that will go against it, and just through their sheer willpower will face the Goliath and tear something down without the replacement. So Aerith is a perfect example of somebody who like knows everything, that can like really f things up for the Arbiters. So like taking away her memories is a priority because she has control over the live stream if she gets in there, like things like that. She has so much more potential to f things up than anybody else. Exactly, which is why they're like the first. She's the first target. She's literally the first target of the Whispers. Is they're like, you need to fucking forget everything that you know right now before this gets out of line. And then it becomes infectious, and the butterfly effect of that is that other people who also have power, like Cloud, are able to all of a sudden see them. And then it's just like, okay, well now this whole thing is off the rails, and we can't, and again, they're reactionary. So it's not like they're immediately after Cloud. It's just like, oh, now he can see them, and they're not going to immediately stop him. Right. You know what I mean? So, but Hojo sees them. I just thought about that. Hojo seems to see them too, which is not a good thing for the future of Final Fantasy.
Right. Hojo can see him, and then President Shinra can't, right? But then Rufus
President Shinra doesn't seem to be able to, but Rufus can.
Right.
And that's because he dies exactly the way that he was supposed to. But as soon as things sort of tiptoe outside of that, then the Whispers are like, oh, and you're supposed to be gone. You were only supposed to do the one thing. Right? Anyway, that was sort of the point, just to kind of clarify why like Reno might not be one, because he's a Turk. He just follows orders, and he actually is complacent. He might feel reluctant, but reluctancy is not an action, you know what I mean? Right. And that's something that the game makes very clear is that you can be reluctant or even passive to it, but you're still a player in the game if you're not. Like if you're not taking some sort of action to stop the thing that you're doing. So
okay. Which actually like leads me into some of the stuff I want to talk about next. Perfect segue. Sure. Everyone seems to think, and including myself actually before the game came out, and probably up until very recently, that the game would start out with the calm flashback. And the more I've thought about that, the more I realized I don't think that makes quite as much sense as a lot of people think, because the calm flashback happens because everyone has questions for Cloud, but coming off of the events of the end of part 1, I don't have questions for Cloud. I want to know what Aerith knows, both from the perspective of the player and from the perspective of the other characters. The information that Aerith has is seemingly a lot more valuable. Aerith is the one who led us to defeat the Arbiters, and she seems to know about Sephiroth in the same way that Cloud does, maybe even more, right? So the question becomes or I guess like the discussion topic, because I don't even know how to really pose it as a question. Like, why would we kind of like start by like talking to Cloud about like the calm flashback and him giving that exposition when there are so many more questions for Aerith? Now, the issue is that, of course, as you're mentioning, that the Whispers want to remove Aerith's memories, right? But I'm under the assumption that by the end of the game, she hasn't like completely forgotten like everything to do with the Arbiters, we think. And it would sort of feel like a, somewhat of a cop-out for say if the game kind of starts and the party asks Aerith and she just like, whoops, I don't remember anything. Right?
I will say actually,
so
and this is something
how does
I will
that
blame.
Yeah.
I will blame a part of this on some of the translation of the scene in Aerith's room in Shinra building is that it's a lot more direct in the Japanese dialogue that pretty much explains to the audience that like she's losing the ability to see the future. She's sort of lost at this point. At that point in the story, she only knows so much that she knew at the outset, or the things that she was given to sort of lead her into that direction. And one of the things that does become clear is not that scene, but in the ending of Intermission, you get that line of dialogue with Aerith talking about that her stomach is in knots and she's not really sure why. And that's your indication right there that she no longer is getting that sort of like sense of direction in a way that she's confident in. She's only getting a feeling, which is very much the setup of her character from the original Final Fantasy VII. Is that she is led by a feeling to go to the water altar. She's led by a feeling that she needs to activate Holy. All of those things are like egging her on through a feeling, not a direct line of that stuff. So not like I'm Aerith from the future sort of levels of like understanding. But to answer your question more directly, I don't know why anybody would expect anything regular to happen at this point.
Yeah.
I use this example in like, and honestly, like I hope that they're very upfront about the change immediately.
Same. Absolutely. I want to walk into comm and not be, and I think one of the things that makes me feel this way, I'm going to sort of explain myself here because I don't think that a lot of the audience, I don't think it's the game's fault. I'm going to say it right there is that I don't think it's the game's fault that is misleading people to think that this game is going to be anything else other than what it is. I think that they're using thematic structure like stamp or visual cues like stamp and giant fights like the final boss, like all three of the final bosses of the game to sort of indicate that this is not going to be a game that is the same. Right.
So,
and I agree with you so much. Like, I think they made that so abundantly clear. So I think it's weird that they that there's so many people that like push against that. Go on. I'm sorry.
Right. No, and I agree. I think it's mostly because it's a hard thing to wrap your head around. And I think people naturally want to create an answer, which is definitely the design of the N2, which is like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, let's like this is a mystery and naturally people want to solve it. Like I naturally wanted to solve the ending of that. So that being said, it's one of the clearest reasons why for me, I just want them to be upfront about it because I think what that conversation has sort of turned into is something that is largely leading to expectations that will not be made, that will not meet that expectation. And I'm not saying in terms of whether it's good or bad, but like if you're expecting like the game to be 100% the same, that's not on the game, that's on your expectation of it to be that. You know what I mean? And whether you look at it or not doesn't change the game.
Yeah.
Right. That's something that I'm like really trying to hit home here. But I think because there is that sort of mentality, I feel like what would only be a way to jar people into place would be to stop using just like these, I guess, vaguer ways of explaining their story, because I don't think the audience is getting it. So like walking into comm, and I use this example on my stream, is walking into comm and just seeing Zack is the be all end all, like bring the ceiling down, this is what's happening sort of moment. I don't think they're going to do that. I think that they should, not for any other reason that people are not going to be ready for it. But if I could anticipate what they're actually going to do is that they are going to continue to just use the visual language that they've created. Schrodinger's baby seal is very set on like the idea of like how stamp is used, and it is effective, and that is something to pay attention to, and to be like paying attention to that is important for the future, and it's something that needs to have it's set up and it needs a payoff, right? Clearly, because we've only seen Terrier stamp once, so you need to explain what that is to people so that actually has a satisfying conclusion or actually leads to an answer for the audience. So they'll probably keep using that. They'll probably keep sort of not doling out information silently, but right away, I don't think that we're going to get the same comm experience that we did before. And that's where you should probably land, right?
Yeah. And that's kind of like the weird thing too, right? Is that in all my discussions with a ton of people, they seem to have like a notion that the plot twist is going to be that there isn't a plot twist. And I think from like just like a writing perspective, that's really lame, right? Like all of this is just being done to trick you into thinking that Final Fantasy VII's changing, but it's not. It's the same game, and it's just all there to, deliberately deceive you, and so that it can all just actually be the same. And I would actually find that very disappointing and weird, right? Like, as much as I don't necessarily agree with the direction that they decided to go here, I would be infinitely more disappointed if the plot twist was that, it's actually just the original game, but we added like this extremely convoluted layer to tell you the exact same story with no real point added to it. That would be more disappointing than like any other direction they could go in for me. Would be to try to be like, this is all just a gotcha, so that we can actually just default back to all the same stuff.
What really solidifies that perspective in terms of like how that's just not going to happen is that the DLC was like, so just in case you guys are wondering, we already changed the game anyway to include the compilation, and that OG plotline isn't even the same anymore because Yuffie's in Midgar and she's in Deep Ground fighting fucking Nero and like messing around with Scarlet, and like there's a character named Sonon, and then Wutai is different completely. There's a whole different governmental system instated in Wutai, and there's like the list just keeps going, and then it's like, and then Avalanche is involved with Wutai and Rufus is in the compilation is involved with Wutai. Like, what the fuck? So like, if you aren't ready, like the game at its core is already different. Before the game, like it might have made you feel things that are because it's the same sort of like beats of the game in the just the central story of like Remake, the base game. But if you didn't get the sense that there were already things that were gonna be different just as a default, I would say that I would not expect any more of that into the future. And the other thing too that I've sort of been trying to hammer home here is that one of the things too that I like so much about the fact that they focus so much on making sure that these characters felt the way that they did is that anytime I saw a character make a decision in the game, I was like, I get why they're making that decision. Like, I would think about it for a second, and maybe at first it was like, I wouldn't make that decision, but that's not really what makes a character feel like a character most of the time. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, that's totally in Barrett's character to do that. So like, I get that. So knowing that they're still acting and responding to the world, and that's something that's very true of VII as well, just the original game, is that these characters are very much like driving the plot. Like, what do we do about the planet? I don't fucking know. I guess we have to go into the center of the planet and like free Holy. Now that we know that, we might die, but we're gonna go do that anyway. They have a lot of that going on, but that is what drives us to each plot point. So all of the characters are still like hitting the things that they would want to do. So I still expect to see certain areas, right? Or to get to certain places. Certain things are still kind of in that sense on the rails. But when something new comes up and we don't have the outcome set for it, or like an idea of what the outcome is, you can only trust them to say what the character would do in that moment.
Right.
And that's what's exciting about it. It's like Barrett's going to get into a new situation and he's going to have to make a decision, and we're going to be like, that's exactly what Barrett would do. Right? That's what I trust them to do. It's not going to be like, oh, that's really out of character for Barrett, you know, or that's really out of character for Cloud to do, or Aerith or Tifa. Like, if anything, the writing has proved to me that they have such a solid base for that I'm comfortable with them making their own decisions. And I'm not talking about Square. I'm talking about the characters. That's how I feel about them. Like, I'm comfortable with them making their decisions and seeing where they fall into this, because it's so clear from like even like some of the extra material that's been coming out, like traces, that like these characters are so they know what these characters are about. They know what they want, and they're sticking to that story indefinitely. And we have compilation stuff also being like hinted at, so I can guarantee you that there's going to be at some point not just Zack, which by the way is the most controversial thing in any, whether you're looking at OG or the compilation, like that is the most controversial thing that's ever happened in Final Fantasy VII's history, bar none. Zack is alive.
Yeah, that is the big wild card here. That's the elephant in the room. Is that Zack is in fact alive. And if I am not mistaken, I believe you are leaning sort of where I'm leaning now, where that is that we're not looking at multiple timelines, we're looking at history being rewritten. Correct?
We're talking about Back to the Future logic is that what that ship bag is symbolizing is the fact that we stole the almanac and the future is fucking different. The town is ruined because we changed something based off of the actions that we took. So, yeah, I am of the mindset of things have been changed in everything is sort of lined up together. In terms of like one sort of thing correcting itself. I'm also just of the mindset here that it's important to just look at it from the perspective of like, it could not be this, right? I could be wrong. This is just something I am mentally entertaining and preparing myself for because of just how blatant it could just be on the surface. Like if you're just looking at this from the surface, like it feels like all of the direction arrows are pointing to them really wanting to be abrasive about all the changes. Like I think it's not to offend, it's just to be blunt. So just looking at it from the sheer bluntness of the end to begin with and taking everything at face value, I destroyed a giant time monster and time is fucked up now and Zack is alive. All of those things sort of line up to me in that sense. Right. So yeah, I guess what I would say is, yeah, I'm open and thinking about directly like it being that you agree with is this thing.
Right. And I guess again, that like is like what's so weird to me is that like they go through all that. You do defeat that big time monster, and then there is just like this strong sentiment. Not everyone, obviously, but there is like a large percentage of people who think that the consequence of all that is absolutely nothing, right? And I think that would be weird, right? If nothing really profoundly or deeply changed about the story, and basically all of that was just like basically it's like the theme of part one is like, you know, you can defy destiny's crossroads, you can change fate. And then if the subsequent parts of the game are like, actually, you can't change fate, everything is fixed in place, this is the way things are always meant to be, right? So you know, like
what's really interesting about that,
right?
What's really interesting about what the words that just came out of your mouth, what they actually apply to completely, is that there's already a Final Fantasy VII game that did that. Really? It's called Crisis Core. So Crisis Core is the game that you're describing.
In what way?
Is that that's actually? So I'll explain this. Is that is the story of just destiny cannot be changed no matter how much you want to change it. That's that story. Is Genesis's story is literally the story of somebody who becomes self-aware of their destiny, fights against it, and fails, and then ultimately is beaten into submission to agree with the path that is given to them, and to literally just succumb to like the direction that the planet chooses for them, which is literally how the game ends for him. Is that he meets a goddess. And in the description of this character is she decides his fate and then sends him away to be brought back again later. So just to really quickly clarify, I know people are like, oh, Genesis, oh, what? Like that character sucks dick. We all know that.
True.
We're not talking about that. I like Genesis, but I'm just saying is that the argument for him at this point is so like it's so irrelevant to what we're talking about is the overall goal of what Final Fantasy VII has been talking about. And if you're looking at what they've been talking about, Genesis was a thematic. This is what I was saying before, is he wasn't a character. He was a thematic placement for explanation and exposition for things. So the story of Loveless is about destiny. It's about this set path for 3 people and what happens. And the outcome of that being that we don't know what happens to these characters. But the idea is that it could completely lead into destruction for all of them or salvation for them. And what that means is undetermined, because the last page of the book is torn out and nobody knows what the ending of the story is, which is essentially where Genesis is like, if I can find the answer to this thing, which is the gift of the goddess, which is a part of the story, in which he also believes is real. He believes that the events of this story are real, and they're based off of an ancient text, essentially, is what Loveless as a play is based off of in the history. Sort of like a Cetra tablet for like Chaos on Omega in Dirge of Cerberus. I know people's eyes are glazing over, so I'll get to the point. Is that with Loveless, it's like, if you can obtain this gift, then you can decide what it is that you want to do, or what you want to be. You can defy destiny. And Zack talks about this, about like what he can do about the situation. He feels like he's being put upon by all of these events, and he can't change any of them. He can't save any of his friends. And then he tries to save himself and he dies. And so he puts upon Cloud his destiny. He's like, you are now living for both of us now, because I tried to do this thing and I couldn't. And now you have to go on and sort of embrace this thing that I was trying to do, which is very convenient for him, because Cloud has cells in him that will literally copy and paste the dreams and memories and like attitude of this character, and really like take that literally. Point is just to say that game was a discussion about that. And so knowing that Remake is the successor of that conversation, if you play Crisis Core and actually like pay attention, even though it's difficult, because the game can be like kind of like unbearable at times, if you really pay attention to what they're trying to do there and what they set out to do in Remake, it's a complete continuation of the themes and story.
And that's why I even say that. And this is probably something you'd probably disagree. I say that Remake is more of a sequel to Crisis Core than the remake of Final Fantasy VII.
Sure. Here's the thing. I don't have any stake in the game of calling it a sequel or whatever the fuck. Like whatever it is that allows you to see it the way that makes the most sense.
To clarify, I wasn't saying like a sequel to Final Fantasy VII. I was saying a sequel to Crisis Core specifically, rather than being like, oh, this is Final Fantasy VII again. It seems more like they're continuing Crisis Core. And I know that like to a lot of people, they're like, what the hell do you mean by that? But there's like nuance in there that like, it seems to be like in the vein of Crisis Core more to me than like in 100%. The vein of the original Final Fantasy VII.
Definitely one of the things that I think gets maybe lost on people who just have played the original game and really don't like the compilation is that there's a lot of like thematic successors that belong from OG in the compilation and then subsequent compilation games. So all of those games, whether you like them or not, are elaborations on the themes of the story of the original game. And so Crisis Core was the final like elaboration on those things, but it never was finished, and it doesn't feel finished either. If you go back and like play through it, it's like there's open-endedness all over the place, even though it was supposed to sort of connect all of the compilation together too. Remake feels like the start of the end of that conversation 100%. I will say that the advantage that Remake has is that it actually has characters that people give a shit about, and like an understanding of like an emotional draw to what people are connecting to. Whereas maybe in the compilation, it's less of that. It's a little less detached and more of like, here's a story that we're telling you. And there's not really that emotional bearing for most people.
Yeah. I think the way that like, by the way, like Destiny, Fate, they're not like, I don't think that they're inherently bad things to like write a story about. And in fact, I think they can be incredibly relatable. I want to clarify my personal position on that, because there's a lot of good ways in which, fate can actually be relatable. Say, for example, in Final Fantasy X, where, Yuna has societal fate. Although I guess the sort of problem I always have with the way Creative Business Unit 1's team in particular implements fate is that it's always in like this bizarre entity. Like, you haven't played the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy, have you?
No.
Right. Okay. So they tend to reuse these same tropes a lot, and I think that is part of why I'm already like my gut is like clinched on how they tend to use them. So like in Final Fantasy 13 too, like they seem to kind of, at least on a surface level of like what we know about remakes so far. So it's not to say that it's definitely this, but it does seem to like even like repeat the beat that like, Kaya's ballad would say, if you change the future, you change the past. And sure enough, at the end, we changed the future and the past seemingly may have been changed as a result. And it's just like a weird way of, Lassie-Falsey relationship could almost be related in the same way as like the Arbiters. And I guess I just have that contention with how they tend to harp on fate a lot and defying it and accepting it, and how they do that in a way that tends to not be relatable, at least for me. But
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I know. I know. I'm like listening to
these names, and it's like, this is what it's like if you didn't know what this is what it's like to be my girlfriend.
This is
like, and then Sephiroth comes in.
That was more for the audience, for the listeners who are aware.
I'm trying to understand, even though I have no idea.
You should actually play the 13 trilogy. If you do, you would kind of understand. You'd be like, oh, this is why Night Sky Prince is like very apprehensive about this direction, because this is the same team coming off of this. And then seemingly these same types of things and implemented it in an oddly similar way are coming back. And so
I will say that just from like Final Fantasy VII's perspective, this isn't completely out of left field.
Right.
For me, at least. And I say that pretty confidently as somebody who's like looked into like Dirge of Cerberus's like multiplayer and shit like that. Things are very, even though they can get out of bounds, there's something that definitely tethers these out there elements to a very core aspect of there's a very clear do and don't when it comes to Final Fantasy VII. You know what I mean? Sort of like what we were talking about with like the whispers and the way that they're sort of like, the way I categorize them as like a weapon is that like it feels much easier to look at that. I think, like, not to comfort anybody or change anybody's opinion on it, but it's very clear that those two things are being treated very similarly, like the way that they act is not any different to me. So that's a do and don't. You don't allow this to do X, Y, and Z because that doesn't fit within the sort of parameters that we have set. But the thing that I will take this back to my video is like one of the things that grounds a lot of these elements is the subject of memory as the discussion of all of like the themes. Like all of the themes branch out from the subject of memories connecting back to this, whether that's lying to yourself. How do you face grief? How do you face like insurmountable problems that nobody has the answer to? Like all of these go back to like believing in or being yourself and approaching things from the trust of yourself to some degree. And here's the thing is that all of those things are very humane ways of handling things, like a very human perspective on a fantasy world. And there are physical manifestations of that subject too, with like Genova, in the fact that she literally keeps people from thinking clearly about the reality of a situation. She is like the embodiment of that sort of like that mentality of not being able to face the truth when that's what you need to like sort of succeed. Sort of like she keeps Cloud physically from reaching himself just inherently by him having Genova cells. But all of the things in Final Fantasy VII are attached to that idea. So it's not just the characters, their story arcs and all of that, but it's also the world systems. It's also the life stream. The life stream, as I theorize in my video, is attached to time itself and how time moves forward. And if you affect a memory of something, you affect the outcome of something in a very similar way. So even though time travel feels like such an intangible thing right now, I think as we move forward, it connects very seamlessly back into all of the things that are very familiar to Final Fantasy VII. And I'm not saying familiar to give people comfort in the fact that like the events will be the same. That's not what that video is about. I don't want people to think that that's the takeaway. What I'm trying to illustrate in most of my videos is that there's a very, very solid foundation that has been and will probably, just because all of the evidence points to this, continue to be used to tell the story effectively. And they're not unfamiliar things. Those are all things that stay in the lane. They're not, those things don't deviate. Like we might go into Dirge of Cerberus and you might be like, this is fucking crazy. Like who the fuck is Shulk? Like what is Deep Ground? Like what are all these like nonsensical elements that like are detracting from my favorite story? I guarantee you, even though that's not what's going to happen, I'm just saying that's not what's going to happen. There is a logic to like the way that the lore elements are handled that connect back to themes. Whether or not it's exciting or interesting is completely up to you and your interpretation of it. Remake has proven, unlike Dirge of Cerberus, to be entertaining, to have an awareness of character, to present those characters well, and to present those themes well enough to be aware of them, to sell them back to the audience. In my opinion, I think that's what it proves, is consistency in the story that it's telling. So I know that we were bringing up inconsistency with like the whispers. I think the exact opposite. I think that the one thing that I can say for certain is not to do with like plot points or whatever, but all the characters are consistent. All of like the themes are consistent with each other. And that's what makes it, to me, like you can build any story out of that. I think is sort of the mentality to take forward with you, is like not trying to convert you or anything, but like just anybody who's willing to listen to my rant is just like those things build a good story as a foundation. Like all of those things can make an interesting plot. Whether or not it's better than the original, I think is, to me, kind of inconsequential at this point. Right. But I want to see all of those things move forward, and I kind of want to see it grow a little bit. Like honestly, like I have picked apart the original game just as much as I picked apart any of the other games. And I love that story just as it is. And I want to see what the next step in that is, kind of. You know what I mean? Like I want a resolved sort of like the evolution of these ideas to grow into something else, which I think Remake kind of provides. I know that I'm tangenting. So your voice is beautiful. I love hearing it. Oh yeah. To most of your point, I think I agree, particularly with consistency of characters up to a point, though. Because I think actually chapter 18 is actually where that stops happening, right? You have Aerith giving the robotic speech. You have literally nobody questioning it, really. They just gotta like, well, this girl who technically we've known for like a few days is like telling us like, hey, we gotta, kill this thing for some reason, and we're gonna do it. And in particular, I found it really weird on the writing for Barrett in particular, that he doesn't question killing the Arbiters. And this is weird for me because the Arbiters saved his life. And so I feel like Barrett like maybe should have hesitated like a little bit with killing the Arbiters, or like having something about that. Yeah. Your line of thinking for me is that it almost seems something that he wouldn't question until later. Like, that's me. That's why Barrett isn't like the leader at the end of the day, is because there are decisions that he makes that are like maybe short-term fixes, right? But in long-term game wise are terrible things that he ends up regretting. Like, he ends up regretting a lot of this first chapter of Avalanche is that he's like, I was doing this selfishly. Like, I was doing this for myself, which, by the way, I think is the main takeaway for me for most of the actions of the characters in this point is that they're sort of seeing it through a funnel of the scope of this, and the end result of it, which is sort of like Aerith's last line, is even she, like, with as much information as she had at that time, which could be more or less than she started out with, was like, we fuck things up a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Even the most assured person. And here's the other thing, and I think that this is actually really good writing to me, is that they trust Aerith so in that moment where it's like she's faltering, she's not sure, and then they back her up because she's their friend and they've been through some shit and there's some weird shit going on, and then all of a sudden at the end of the game, after committing to the friendship and like, you know, committing to this direction, she continues to hesitate, and you're just like, oh, so like maybe we shouldn't have done this. Maybe we shouldn't have. Maybe this is the worst case scenario. Like, maybe, and again, going back to that feeling, is it supposed to leave us also being like, bitch, you weren't certain? Like, you're fucking changing history right now. You know what I mean? So like, it's supposed to emphasize those things. But here's the thing is that even Barrett, when he first hears about the Arbiters, he's like, this could all be horseshit. Like, this is coming out of a dog. Like, this, like, how am I supposed to believe that this isn't like a Shinra, like, whatever? And then they find out that there's like a connection between all of them, that there's something that connected Aerith to Red 13. And then there's something pulling these characters together when they're fighting the Whispers, where they can see flashes of their fate and future events with each other involved, like Aerith getting stabbed. And it's like, oh my God, like, that's where we go. Like, we end up going down this road, and then I guess we get fucked because here's Aerith getting stabbed by this dude that we just met. It's crazy. I love it.
I just feel like that, like, maybe I still feel like that maybe Barrett should have hesitated or had some kind of like line about being like, you know, thanks for saving me or something like that. I don't know. That still sits weird to me personally. Like,
I will say that it is. I get that. I get that perspective, just because he does. You could see him reasoning it out though, and Red 13 sort of telling him it's like almost inconsequential. Like, whether or not you were saved just now is not really their prerogative. They don't feel anything for you. They're not acting on your behalf. They're acting on behalf of everything else. And that this could either go, the course of destiny itself is bad. So you surviving is only for the purpose of this bigger machine that you don't agree with, or that we are being presented with that we don't agree with. Which is that this, like Barrett even says, is like, okay, so even if our destiny is shitty, like, they're going to keep us on that course. And then he's like, yeah, pretty much. So whatever they're doing is not for the benefit of us. It's for the benefit of something else. And we should probably stop that, because if it is a dark course, then it probably needs to be altered, which is what Aerith then sort of swings in to sort of convince everybody of that is a good idea. Whether or not that's the right decision or not is not really clear. So,
good response. Okay, I got a couple of hard-hitting questions for you, and then we'll take questions from the audience here. So these are my heavy hitters, man. I know you're gonna hate these.
I'm so ready to hate these questions.
If Zack really is alive, and he really is in the current timeline, in what seems to increasingly be the case, right? If we can agree that that's like kind of the premise that
Yeah, let's
we're
go with
looking at
that.
here. What do you think this could add to the story? And what do you think the resurrection of sort of a dead character can do to be any sort of metaphor or allegory that can reflect the human condition, which is what made the original Final Fantasy VII such like a powerful story, right? Because everything in it is layered with metaphor and allegory that really ties into things that represent our current condition as human beings. So for me, it's just such a struggle to imagine reviving a dead character in almost any capacity as something that can somehow symbolize something that anyone can relate to. And that's not to say that it hasn't been done to some success before. You have something like WandaVision, right? Where she was able to sort of revive Vision in like a bubble, right? But even then, that had limitations to it, and eventually she had to be confronted and she had to finally accept and process that grief. Maybe this is going there, I don't know. But what do you think is the ultimate way in which this can actually be a relatable human thing, or how is it a metaphor for anything deeper? How does it represent something other than just fan service?
So that's, I think, a really great question, because again, sort of like going back to what I mentioned before is that there is a level of consistency through the compilation to this story of Remake. And I think this actually goes back to Advent Children for the most part. And also some of the lines of dialogue that we've been seeing in like Crisis Core and Remake, specifically having to do with like Sephiroth and Cloud's relationship. But I'll start at Advent Children, which is Nojima, who wrote it, was discussing sort of the road that Cloud was on through Advent Children, and that by the end, he had sort of come face to face with the grief, more or less, is that he has confronted his regret of what he's done or what he didn't do, and is facing that and is accepting to move forward with that in mind. With the idea of like becoming better and being there for the people that like the grief was mainly taking him away from, which was like the people around him at the time. But Nojima clearly sort of lays it on thick and is like, but this is just the start of the process of healing that story, like that grief. All Cloud has done in Advent Children is recognize the grief and confront that it's real and that it is something that he needs to face by himself. Now flashing forward to knowing that Remake is sort of like spiritually a successor to all of these ideas, I would say that Remake is lining Cloud up for that experience. Is that this is not the experience of going through the OG and experiencing the suddenness of grief, because I think that's what it does very well, is that there's like the suddenness of grief and dealing with that thing in the moment. But what Advent Children is about like, oh, this doesn't just happen here. This stays with you forever. And you need to like confront that and deal with it and move on. And that's what Advent Children did, is that he recognizes that he has to move on. What Remake is Cloud learning how to actually do that well. That's what I see Remake ultimately coming into. Now, one of the things that is very clear, I think, to everybody is that Zack is pivotal to how Cloud becomes the person that he is. He is very much a forming figure, both literally and metaphorically, to this character. I would say if there's any point to that, that sort of story that Zack has anything to do with, it is to be that sort of character to illustrate that theme of not just confronting grief, but actually how do you work through this and work through it in a way where you can like live on and actually like live your own life. I think by the end of this story, that's sort of the overall message. It's like, if you're going to finish Final Fantasy VII, let's finish the grief. Let us confront the grief. Let us live with it, own it, and then see Cloud actually happy in a certain way at the end of this. In a way that isn't like bullshitting. You know what I mean? I'm not trying. It doesn't matter. I don't think just, I haven't been reading like chat at all, but I think Alive or Dead is inconsequential. Is that knowing that you've lived the life that you want to live is ultimately, this is why Aerith is the way that she is that like we kind of find out that like she did this thing and she might have regretted the decision that she made in life, right? Is that this leads to an uncertain future where I am like, everyone is fucked. Maybe this is not the best future or the outcome, and I regret that decision. And so a lot of like what Aerith says in Remake is under the same lens of regret. It's like, I didn't handle this properly. Like, let me try this again and really try and emphasize this and emphasize direction and help you grow when it comes to like talking to Cloud. It's a very weird thing to sort of like try and wrap your head around the fact. And I think this is where people ultimately get stuck on the game is that the suddenness and the OG is one thing, but knowing that it's a sequel of the themes of the compilation is that it's not about that anymore. It's about how we go into this properly and how do we process this. That's one of my favorite things about the original game is that it's so blunt with all of its dialogue and characters are just very on the surface like who they are and they kind of deliver that and you experience that and it's a very visceral thing, which makes the death visceral as well, very like real. It feels sudden. This feels like I'm in the middle of processing it. Like I'm going through everything with the comb, which is what you have to do. If anybody has actually experienced this before, is like you need to go through what you think and feel with a fine-tooth comb and really assess everything. And it has that sort of level of attention to it, in my mind, Remake, is that it's so aware of itself that I feel like that's ultimately what like Zack and his goal and his mission will be, whether that's, you know, larger than life or very personal in terms of like just his interactions with characters. Right. That's sort of how I see his character kind of being handled. It's just as a piece of this moving puzzle of dealing with grief.
Right. I think where that somewhat troubles me too is that like, I feel like whether thematically it's a sequel or how you want to view it, I feel like the original really encapsulated that whole arc with grief. And if we are looking at it from a literal perspective of a sequel, then I feel like that sort of undermines that sort of original ending where it does feel like he did that. And I can honestly, you know, like that's kind of a big criticism of Advent Children too, kind of like as we were talking like before that, that it's sort of like it sort of like goes back into that re-traumatizing Cloud so that we can have another story, rather than, at least for me thus far, adding on anything that I would personally describe as a meaningful addition to it, because I felt like the original already had wrapped that up in such a beautiful way that things like Advent Children, or if Remake is trying to do that, it just seems like ripping the band-aid off of a wound that's already healed and then putting another band-aid on just to like rip it back off until you start just taking skin off. I don't know what's a good metaphor for it, but that's kind of like my issue with it, is that you know, is having him there going to really add anything powerful to that, in which was already wrapped up in a beautiful way, and that felt so complete, until they tried to, I don't know, create another wound in order to make the same thing happen. Because I feel like that already was so well resolved in the original, so if it's a sequel to those themes, I just don't understand like because the original to me just left that off at such a perfect place that
I get what you mean.
Yeah, like diving back into it just seems like so, like it doesn't feel like it can
haphazard,
right? And then diving back into it in the way that they're doing by like having him alive again is where like it's hard for me in my brain to connect where that or how that actually goes deeper into the grief in any way, like I can like think of like instantaneously. Not to say that it's not possible, because there are certainly things that they can do that I just hadn't considered. But I guess I just wanted to ask, do you have like any kind of rebuttal to that before I like move on to like the final question?
Yeah. I actually think that that's what, because it's funny to me personally, because sort of one of the things that you're sort of emphasizing is like, why are we ripping the Band-Aid off? That's kind of what the ending of the game is. It's just like, there's like a sudden abrasive, like, oh, this isn't the same thing that you thought it was. And like, you're feeling a certain way about it, for me as well. And I think that's the Band-Aid that you're kind of describing quite a bit too, is like, why are we reopening this wound to experience something like this again with that character? And I think that's part of the challenge for them, is to like, why are we doing this? Like, why would we need to do this at all? And I think that's where the rest of the story needs to tell the story, is that these characters need to go through something that proves the point that this is worth all of this fucking headache for people. Like, and that's what everyone is going to be scrutinizing this game from, and that perspective of like, what is so valuable in this game other than money? right. To experience this game in this way that you want to see me experience it. Like, why did you not take the safe route here? Why did you not take the safe route of doing this? Is it out of fear? In retrospect, is it going to be out of fear of like trying to match that? Is it going to be because you really genuinely have something to add to the conversation of this? And again, the rebuttal is that, and I don't know if you got this feeling or not while playing the game or not, but everything about this game when it comes to Cloud and the relationship that he has with like these very heavily polarizing figures, whether that's Sephiroth or like Aerith or like Tifa, like, or just like his friendships as well. Like, there's a huge amount of fragility to that character now. That is so, like, I played through the opening of the OG, and Cloud is just a fucking asshole. Like, he's just like a douchebag.
I love it.
And that's a really effective, yes, and I agree with you. It's a very effective way of getting you to kind of be like, well, this asshole. Like, I'm easily connecting now to like all these other characters around Cloud because they're more human, and that's one of the things that you start off with the game not really considering is that Cloud is actually like this extremely fragile-minded character by this point in the game. But in Remake, he just feels like you're holding something that could just break the moment that somebody like blows on it wrong.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's how the whole game feels to me, is as an extension of that, is that everything feels so fragile and so assessed and calculated to a point to make it feel that way, that it makes me more open to what they plan on doing with this later. Right, is that I feel like that they perfectly primed all of these characters to get put into such a vulnerable place that even if it isn't, let's just say for the sake of argument, that it isn't as effective as the original game, I still think that I will be moved. Like, I think that I will not be able to help myself but feel something extremely profound about something that happens to these characters. Right. Even if it's not something that I'm familiar with or not, or like I trust them to do that correctly. So I will definitely never sit in the place of saying that this game replaces the original game.
Right.
Nothing would replace it.
Right.
And I guarantee you, even if we got that remake the way that we wanted it to, there would still be complaints.
Right, of course,
like,
yes.
which one is better. And that's just how all remakes are of anything, even if they're good. So I think personally, I'm super open though to the fact that this game is very emotionally told. And that's what I liked so much about the remake and the original. And to do it in, a lot of people might sit here and be like, well, you could just tell a different story with different characters. The point is that it is these characters, because that's the vessel. That's what makes the original good. Is it's like everything else could be interchanged maybe and be fine. And I'm giving them the chance to prove that, because I actually think that the best thing about Final Fantasy VII are the characters, not the story, not the fact that Sephiroth summons a meteor. I think it's the way that the characters interact with the world around them. So to be able to do that again through this is going to be, I think, the most exciting thing ever. Like, I'm super down to not know what's going to happen, but to trust in them and the characters to do something interesting.
Beautiful response. And I think for me, who, as someone who really, really looks deep into stories and finds meaning for him, if I were to kind of give like my own personal take on that, for me, it's not just the characters. For me, absolutely no story for me actually almost is completely carried by characters. And that is me personally. 7 in particular, for me, was not carried by characters. It was carried by the meanings and messages. And so I guess that's why someone like me, for example, is uneasy about, like, you know, where the story is. But I think the majority of people are probably more like you, where for them it is carried by mostly the characters. But like, if I'm honest, like, you know, like in like the grand scheme of like my ranking of Final Fantasy characters, like 7's characters, like a lot of them aren't that high, if I'm honest. For me, it was like what I actually loved about 7 was like the messages and themes and those sorts of things that are like, just, that's why I find like just like so unique and it's like so compelling about 7. And so for me, like, characters alone can't really sustain like all of 7 for me. I think that if you're in my position, if you're someone in my position, they will still have to deliver something that, you know, thematically and message wise is really powerful. And I don't think that they're, you know, out of the game yet, despite like some of my criticisms for that. I think that maybe there is still like a way out there for them to kind of deliver that. By the way, chat, go ahead and start asking your questions. I got like one more. Are you good for time right now? Like, I think we got like 30 minutes.
I'm totally good with whatever cool. You're down for.
Okay, perfect. Like, to that point though, like, if like I look at a character in their arc and how they serve the story and the themes and messages and how that serves the overarching narrative, and then that's kind of like how I attach myself to a character. And so for me, if a character's arc changes to me, then you've actually changed like the whole character, and I'm not sure if I like them anymore, even if like the surface level characterization stays the same. So but like I said,
I agree with you.
Yeah,
I do agree with you on that sentiment as well. Yeah. And it's something that I guess I was not being like 100% like clear on is that also falls in line with everything else that I said as well, which is that I'm really passionate about the characters and I love the characters and I want to see them experience it. But one of the other things that Remake to me has already proven is that the thematic structure is the same. And that's why I'm good to just let this happen.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So for what you just said, as far as agreeing with like the interconnectedness of the characters, I'm saying for this particular story with Final Fantasy VII and Remake, it's because those two things are almost the same that I'm okay with seeing what happens. Because those two things are handled appropriately in Remake and faithful to them in my view of it, both the characters and the themes. and taking those things into something else, I think is what is the winning combination here. If it wasn't that, then I think that I would, because the fragility of Cloud is also like I've talked about, if you guys watch my last video too, is like I spend like the first like 25 minutes like explaining why the world is so connected to the characters, and that the characters are so connected to the world. Like they're the same thing at that point. You can't see them any differently. So yeah, I agree with you on that point. I just was like, oh, wait a second. Yeah. But I agree with you completely. So,
this is the last one that I have personally. And then we're going to take audience questions. So audience, feel free to post your questions now, highlight them so that it's easier for me to like go back through and pick them out. This is something that we've talked about a lot before. And I just kind of like want to get your take on it now and like your updated thoughts. All of this is a lot of information, right? Because even as I'm like playing the game on stream, I start thinking of like a lot of things, and there is a lot of information here, like to sort of like consume, and it's weird, right? Because Final Fantasy VII, like in like a broader sense, even though this story has been with me, I think going on 25 years now, and then including the compilation and all that material and stuff, I find it kind of difficult to actually like keep track of all this, right? And as like, and this is like someone as like a core fan who can even like have difficulties keeping track of all this information and how it like actually is supposed to tie together. And then Remake is adding like a pretty substantial layer on top of all of that other information as well, right? And so, I mean, even other stuff like you know, Final Fantasy 14, which is like 5 full Final Fantasy games long, which is like the first time they've ever told like an epic like inside of like this series, right? And at the end of like all 5 of those games, when I completed Endwalker, I feel like I comprehended almost every single like important detail like at the end of it. And there's still some stuff that I was kind of like, wait, why did such and such do this and then that, and then but there are relatively straightforward and definitive answers for a number of those things. And so what I'm getting to is, do you think it's possible for them to effectively communicate all of this information in a way, and maybe not so that everyone can get like every single detail, but in a way that like people can get the big picture story without having to play the original or play the compilation or dive into what will be, by the time Remake finishes, over 3 to like 3.5 decades worth of material just by playing this series? Is that possible for them to communicate?
Well, I think it depends on what they're using it for, right? So if they're just using it for the sake of, oh my God, we don't have anything to talk about, like, let's fucking throw this in here and stuff it in. Like, if we're just adding it, like, as, like, just, like, with a stick, just stuffing it in.
Right.
Get in there. Like, into the original, I would say that you would probably have some trouble there. But knowing that there's a lot of potential differences coming up, I would say that more of that is for the sake of the story that it's trying to tell than it is for trying to reinforce maybe like some other points that they are plot points, specifically story points that we've sort of like discussed. Like maybe we don't get like the Nibelheim thing, but if that doesn't happen in this sort of line of thinking, then what else does it have in store for us? So you can assess literally the whole game like that, and see what they have potentially set up as more of that, like more whatever that new thing is going to be. I would say it from that perspective. And then don't get me wrong, like there are things that are like, just as an example, and sort of like what you're getting at is that like Remake has paid such close attention to like a lot of the compilation elements that it like stuck a boss's like behemoth horn onto a boss fight that is optional in Remake as a nod to Dirge of Cerberus and a nod to lore. But does that change the fight or the outcome of that fight or your enjoyment of that fight or the story overall? Not really.
Right.
So even though they're very specific, some of these things do not have to get in the way of it. You know what I mean? Right. And I think this is one of the, a lot of people are like, why are you like talking about the compilation or comparing the story for like the compilation to like Remake, is because what a lot has been set up that I'm pretty fucking certain about, like the stuff that I am like super confident about them using have been the things that are the most consistent through Remake, through the DLC, as far as evidence is concerned, and also Trace is also being involved with that as well. Do I believe that every single one of those plot points is going to be like the forefront of the story? I don't think so. I think that a lot of the story, and one of the advantages that Remake has is that it does a very good job of just telling the conclusion of a story from like the compilation in the background. Diabolical Creation is a perfect example, because there's a character in Before Crisis that is carrying secret soldier data, and Cloud is like, and the Turk are like helping her through this mission, and then she fails her mission. Avalanche like takes the data, or something happens to the data, and they just can't get access to it at the end of the day, so it ultimately doesn't matter. But this scientist's name is Rayleigh, and then in the DLC you go into the Diabolical Creation fight, and her theme in Japanese is Diabolical Rayleigh. And the insinuation is that this is what happened to that character. This is a monster that you're fighting. Now, does that like create any sort of emotional resonance? Not really. But then on the other hand of the DLC, you have Yuffie's character being set up through the lens of her character framing from all of the compilation Before Crisis. And I think arguably, not arguable, this is an inarguable point, is that Yuffie immediately feels better with all of those things already connected to it. And I think that her character is infinitely more interesting than it ever was or could have been. And all of that background is using stuff from the compilation, is the relationship with Avalanche, like allowing her to share her perspective on like what she thinks the world is like through Sonon because of their dealings with Avalanche in the past. Like Wutai being like a war-ridden like history and how that's affected them. And then the whole Godo thing, which could very easily tie into another Before Crisis element, being that Rufus Shinra kind of controls Avalanche in the compilation, and they're seemingly, that's the one thing I'm going to sit here and be like a stingy like theory crafter guy about is that I'm calling that shot. So you hear it here. If that happens, you just know that we were on it by this point in history. We got that one. That's the one that I would say is also contributing to his character too, because it makes Rufus infinitely more interesting. It makes Yuffie's interaction with Avalanche more interesting, and it also increases Barrett's involvement with his story. His story gets fleshed out just through the sake of that as well. Is that what if like Shinra controls it? Then it's like, and they're kind of partially responsible. Avalanche is partially responsible for the destruction of Corel in the compilation. So what's that going to be like when Barrett hears that for the first time as a potential outcome? And
to sort of elaborate like a little bit too, like on what I mean there, where we take like an audience question, is like the actual stuff that like is proprietary to Remake too, right? Like say for example, like Zack or like the Arbiters and stuff like that, and that's like the stuff we're talking about, like with like the compilation, like sometimes I get the reference, sometimes I don't, but it doesn't matter. 14 is like a very similar way. Like if you don't play FF4 and you don't know what the Loporits are, it's cool. You don't need to know what the Loporits are, but if you do, it's like it's awesome, right? But you don't need to know why there's bunnies on the moon. But there's bunnies on the moon. So
I did not know that.
Right? That's just like, hey, if you know, you know, right? This is like, you can kind of like perceive where it's coming, where it's going.
Sure.
I like My issue is that like things like the Arbiters, for example, add a lot of questions and a lot of complexities, and like in order to make something like them like work in a coherent way, you have to have like a lot of things communicated, on top of which there is a lot of, I mean, like even in the original Final Fantasy VII, some people who weren't like knee deep in FF7 would have even criticized OG for possibly being convoluted. Not that I think that it was, but you know, that was always a sort of like looming sort of criticism of it. And
I did not know that.
Yeah, like there were some people that felt that way. Some people that still do. Donkey, for example.
I can see it. I just don't think for me it was like oh, okay,
right.
just very intense exposition scenes,
right,
is what I would say. But that's kind of given with the fact that any RPG sort of has like that moment, right, where it's like, this is what's happening.
Yeah, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is that like, is there a way to like, or do you have a strong amount of faith, or however you would like to, you know, answer the question, or you know, answer this idea that like, how does one effectively communicate or deliver these ideas? Because like, even like when you talk about the Arbiters or Zack and all these other concepts and stuff like that, in chat, anywhere in the community you find, there are people with such wildly different ideas on what all this is supposed to mean. And then I listen to people like you, or like Schrodinger's baby seal, and then I'm like, oh, okay, that really makes sense to me. That really resonates with me. That okay, I understand that. But I feel like, and as someone who's been through a good majority of this content, right? I still, I feel like going through it, I'm like, I really don't know what this is. Like, the plot twist at the end of the game, for example, like, what is the plot twist, right? Like, what is the plot twist of Chapter 18, other than Zack, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means that, like, Sephiroth absorbs the whispers into his wing. Am I supposed to be afraid of that? Is that supposed to be bad? Like, what is the consequence?
I don't think that you're supposed to be certain.
Right.
I think what you're expressing is literally, and this is sort of where this sort of, I think it would be wrong of me to tell you anything different. Right. That's probably true. That's probably true. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, like, already from part 1, there is so much that has to be communicated going forward with like what this is, right? Like, I don't even know if you agree with that thesis. Like, maybe I'm asking like a question that like we don't even agree on the premise of. But is there anything that you wanted to add to that, like about how this is going to be done, right? Like, talk about this in the future. That is that isn't the be all end all of this story, just going into bonkers land, right? Because I feel like it be acceptable, right? Like, how does it come together for the layman's? Like, do you think that that's possible for, like, you know, the average person who's not knee deep in Final Fantasy VII to? No, I think it's 100% something that could be accepted. I think it actually already has to some people that have played the game for the first time and are like, okay, this is it. I think this is sort of the weird thing from the perspective of like a new player. It's just that they're just like, oh, okay, like, this is it. Yeah, this is what's happening. And they just kind of go into it like that. And not that I think that the aim is for everybody to feel that way. I think the more you know about Final Fantasy VII, the more uneasy you're supposed to sort of feel about like this game, is because there's so much of it that you either care about or treasure or don't want to see damage or reprehensibly just done to this thing that we like. I do think that I would do it through a character. like I would do it through the same way that you would use Cloud to sort of explain the story of Final Fantasy VII in the OG. I think that's the right way of doing it.
Right.
I think the reason that we connect so solidly to the planet, the functions, what's happening in the world in that game is because literally everything is so interconnected. But it's also because you have characters that are able to sort of like, you connect to the character and therefore give a shit about like all of these other things, and then are able to connect to the themes and all of this other stuff. Because one of the things that like I did question, or I'm not going to go into the whole discussion, but we were talking about the start of Final Fantasy VII OG in comparison to Remake. And one of the things that you're not fucking thinking about like the planet right away. Because you're not really prone to the repercussions of what the things are yet, but you're sort of getting the worldview of things through the characters around you, and you start giving a shit about them, and then you sort of see what's happening, and you get like kind of a sense of the world, and then the repercussion happens when you start seeing the rest of the story being told. I would just say that that's the focus of it at first, and then you start to experience the rest of it in the full force, right? But they need to get you sold on one thing first. And that is to give you somebody to care about. And if you care about that person effectively, then I think you could pretty much get away with a lot. I'm not saying that in the sense that the whispers, I think, are a weak element of the story. I personally don't have any qualms with that in terms of like fate talk or anything like that. Obviously, like going into that conversation that I just don't understand, which is like 13 or whatever, or some other Final Fantasy games. Yeah. Like I don't have that experience whatsoever. So whether or not that means I'm better or worse off for feeling the way that I do is
you're better off
to be seen. But as far as this is concerned, I think that's how Final Fantasy VII has succeeded in the past. And I think that's where it's also, ruined itself as well. I.e. like the compilation and the characters in that you don't connect with, which is why those games don't really even have much traction. You know what I mean?
Right.
Is that you can't sell me Deep Ground without me giving a shit about the character, and immediately one of the first characters you asked me to give a shit about is a emotionless vampire. And a character that literally shows no emotion.
Right.
and that's like the animeist of tropes, and really hard. Like those are supposed to be reflectors, right? Characters that don't have emotion are supposed to be sort of like reflections of the other characters, or like a way of like contemplating our own inner self. And you stick that Vincent next to a character like that, and it's just like, oh my God, like I'm snoring. It's fucking ridiculous.
No, absolutely.
That's how I would do it.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's overcomplicating it necessarily. I think that it's just going to be told through that lens. I would say that that's the most effective way that they could do it. Whether they do that, I have no idea. So
that sounds great to me. Let's go through these.
I have a question for you.
Oh, actually, yeah, I forgot. You have questions for me. Gosh, let's.
I have one.
Hit me, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
The one question I really wanted to know is that did the story of Intermission, because I was so excited to watch you play it, did that actually give you a better impression moving forward, or did it make it worse? Do you feel at all more comfortable with Final Fantasy VII Remake after playing the DLC? That was my main question, because I thought that to me it's a boiling down of everything that is positive and negative, and I've only seen positive things said about it, but I have also seen like an outpouring of negativity in terms of like people's impression of the DOC stuff. Clearly, like, why is this here? So
as a DLC episode, I don't think you can be like more ideal in a sense, right? Because it's something that, while technically is probably going to be important, because clearly Nero's not dead and there is set up there for some deep ground stuff that will probably happen later on. It's just like, hey, if you don't play it, it's not going to be like you are just going to be fundamentally lost, right? It's not like a sort of like Kingdom Hearts situation, like, bro, you skipped the rhythm game. Well, good luck. Yeah. So it's not going to be that. It's not going to be like it's not Final Fantasy 15 where, hey, you want to know like how like one of the main characters went blind? Well, Too bad. That's DLC. All right. So, like, yeah, like it's like it strikes a much better balance, and I would actually go as far as to say it's probably one of the better DLCs that Square has ever put out. Now, that being said, like at the same time though too, and I want to steal this. Actually, before I move on to that, I want to steal a joke from like Fish Fry Cat. Fish Fry Cat said this. He's like, if I can remember the wording right, he's like, remake is so good when you don't have the whispers in your ear telling you it's a sequel. And that's that was a like really profound statement to me, because one of the biggest problems I have, obviously with remake, is the whispers. Not just their function, not just their concept and their purpose, but the fact that they ruin scenes, like just outright ruin, sorry, personal opinion, but they outright ruin scenes to me that just would have had such a perfectly fine flow. Some of these scenes are just flowing like beautifully, and then the arbiters show up and it's just like, the chat has seen, like, I want to groan and I roll my eyes, because it's such a bad way, in my opinion, to progress those scenes that were perfectly fine without them. And it's just like, you already had a flow for them, right? And so basically what I'm trying to say is that intermission was great because there was no whispers, other than if you try to intersect your seven. Sure. And actually, I totally get that. And actually, in a weird way, like intermission like reinforced to me how good remake can be when it changes stuff and it doesn't involve the whispers, right? I'm like, dude, this is so good and doesn't hurt anything and only adds, because they don't do the thing that, in my opinion, completely hurts the story of the base game. And so, yeah, like in a way, I enjoyed intermission more than the base game. Does it give me more faith in like where the story's headed overall? Not really, because it also doesn't like do much to change in that way. But as an isolated piece of content, it's very, very good. It's very, very fun.
Do you think that Yuffie got changed enough? Like, do you feel like any differently about that character than you did from OG? Like, do you think that
characterization? Perfect.
Do you think that specifically that addition made her better? Like all of the stuff surrounding her, or her attitude and everything like that? Did she get like the proper treatment, sort of like remake wise?
She did. Okay. She did. I felt like she was very properly well represented. So
OG Yuffie or remake Yuffie? Whatever
Yuffie I had in my head. Whatever. No. Like in a way, I feel like it is like it's like the best answer I can give, right? Because it's sort of like
no, I was just fucking.
Yeah, like I've because there's kind of like the perception, right, of like when we read something and then like once it gets like fully acted and all those sorts of things. But how I imagined her is pretty much that. So that was kept in check. In terms of characters like Sonon, Sonon wasn't as cringe as I was expecting. He wasn't what I would call a like good character, but he's not what I call an actively bad one. So that's,
you know what? To your point, he feels more like the Avalanche members from the OG than the Avalanche members in Remake feel now. Like those are like characters, and like one of the first things out of Wedge's mouth in the OG is like, "Don't you think we have like a big bright future ahead of us?" And you're like, "You're dead." Like, you're
dead. Yeah,
you like that's a death flag. You can just see it immediately that this is what's happening to this character, and that's exactly how I feel about Sonon. Is that as soon as he opens his mouth, he's like, "My sister died, and I didn't do anything to stop it." It's like, well, we know what's fucking happening to you. Yeah. Like even in the trailer, we knew this guy was dead from the moment.
Yeah. Like everyone was like, "Yo, this guy is dead." And it was pretty obvious. It does
enforce something for Yuffie later, so it's like I get why he's there. That's how I see him. Is like this is exactly what some of the other characters were used for in the original game, and I'm fine with this. It's not like you said, it's not like I'm thrilled about it. I'm not thrilled with Sony.
Right.
You know what I'm really not thrilled about is him coming back as a Heartless. I'm really feeling that.
Right.
That coming back somehow too. I don't know what that.
Yeah, I don't know how, but yeah, he's coming back as something. And yeah, so intermission is pretty solid. To me, when you talk about like remake and you talk about adding things and you talk about things that weren't necessarily in the original, Yuffie is more along the lines of kind of like what I personally had in mind, as opposed to the Arbiters. And I feel like this delights and surprises in a way that I may not like readily predict every single thing, but it adds like delight for veteran fans while also being new. And like when something like the Arbiters like is something that's so hard for me to wrap my head around and feel like it's like adding something that's genuinely powerful, or not even like powerful, but like even something that was like, like worthy of, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend you with this, but even worthy of existing. It doesn't go that deep for me. Yeah. So if you don't like it, I'm okay. And trust me, like, and just know that mainly I just love hearing the opinion that you have regardless of what it is. Yeah. And so it's not any sort of negativity to me. So TLDR, the intermission made me realize how much more deeply I hate the Arbiters.
Well, and you know what's funny is that as soon as you were saying, and I found out that you were going to be playing it for the first time, I literally thought to myself, and I think I even mentioned it in your chat, I was like, this is literally perfect for you.
I was I
can't express enough without spoiling it, but like there's so much here for you that you can have that I think you're really like. I was like, he loves the combat of the base game, and he doesn't like the whispers. This is like a seller. This is
big win. Big win.
Layup.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I wanted to ask you is how you felt about the DOC and inclusions, and whether or not that either negatively affected or made any sort of positive impression, or neither, and you felt indifferent. And regardless of like yes or no, like how do you feel about more of these things being included, maybe potentially into the future of the game, of the series, the sequel, remake?
I call it the re-experiencing of Final Fantasy VII. That way I can just skip over
right now.
That way I can skip over all like the nuance that people have, like, or conjecture, I should say, not nuance, but like that people like kind of throw out there. So I'm gonna be blunt. This thing should have been available on PS4. It should have been available for the majority of their audience. So? It should have been available. Yeah, it absolutely should have been available for the majority of their audience. I don't think that there is. I mean, obviously, it does look a little bit prettier than what we saw in the PS4 game, but I think that it should have been ground up designed for both. I think that it absolutely should have, and I don't think that locking out like such a large percentage of the audience during the silicone shortage, because it's not like it's something I could have forgiven like a little bit easier when considering that like if you could just walk into a store and buy a PS5. But this is something that even Sony is aware of, right? Like God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn are now coming to PS4. Why? There's not enough PS5s for the games to even sell on, right? Like there's just not enough. Do you think
that they might have started it like with the mindset that they might have, and obviously this is just like theoretically speaking, because it seems like most of these games have the backwards compatibility with the PS4. Games that were probably meant to be for the next generation of consoles. Yeah. But obviously like you said, the world is a very different place. And a lot of these deals, though, and a lot of these plans are made so ahead of time. Do you think that with the release of it and where they were going to go with it, that they just either
miscalculated, right? Yeah.
Miscalculated, only for the sake of not being able to see what was coming around the corner that nobody could have? Or do you think that they were just hard set to like sell this on a console, to sell the console regardless of the fact, knowing maybe that it wouldn't be available to everybody, or everybody wouldn't be able to play it?
It's totally possible that they cut a deal with Sony, right? Because we already have the time, like exclusivity. And so if I were to give them benefit of the doubt, I would say that maybe there was a deal that they cut with Sony. Because on a technical level, even though they say it was optimized for PS5, the way Unreal Engine 4 is scalable, and just looking at the design of the game, I just cannot see anything that just absolutely could not have been like downgraded and made possible for like PS4. Like on a tech level, nothing on there is like, oh my god, like you just can't do this on PS4, because it's not that significant of like a tech leap from what the base
and I
game
agree.
is.
I completely agree with what you're saying. Is that, and I've thought about this question quite a bit myself, because it definitely, I don't think that I have the knowledge or the know-how to say that it should be or shouldn't be, but I would say that it didn't look that much of a step forward to me personally. That couldn't have just been like longer load times, sure, whatever, fuck it. Like if it's that big of an issue, but to me, it sort of comes off as like wrong place, wrong time sort of thing. Whereas like I could see Demon Souls being like a PS5 seller, you know?
Right.
Like in terms of like it looks
right. Like, yeah, that looks like PS. Right.
This is like in engine. They probably would have made more money being able to sell it that way.
And I don't even think we've seen like, the PS4 versions of. Oh, sorry to cut you up. I was gonna say I don't even think that was it. Yeah, I don't even think we've seen like the PS4 versions of Horizon and God of War yet. Like we haven't even seen what those look like, and obviously they're gonna be quite uglier. They're gonna be quite ugly when compared to like the PS5 versions, and they got those working with the scalable engine like that.
Somebody
I don't
made
understand.
A functional version of Intergrade on a jailbroken PS4. So yeah, it can run on PS4. Well,
wow, Baby Seal in the chat dropping that truth bomb there, which isn't like popular news, because no one really wants to report on that illegal activity, or be reported on, I should say. But like, yeah, it's just like, yeah, there was no reason for that. Unreal Engine 4 scales well enough. There was some kind of deal that was cut. With
the Epic
Sony
Game Store, even that whole thing seems to be also in that same line of like, this is how it can be released, this is where it's going for now, that yada yada yada. So I agree that it definitely seems attached to that, and then just because it was on paper, regardless of where the world was at the time, they were just like, you still have to do this, and they were just like, fuck. I guess only some people get the Yuffie story until the PC release, I guess.
Was there any other part of that question that I didn't answer? Because I feel like there was
the DLC stuff.
About the future.
Did it affect it?
I did like this DLC. I don't want them to ever do this again, though. Because I feel like at some point you do end up with the Final Fantasy 15 situation. Where it's just going to feel like if you are not
padding,
if you are
not connecting the story properly,
right, that or actively removing parts of the story to sell as DLC, and that's a slippery slope. It is a slope that has got them into trouble before. If anything, I thought that something like The First Soldier should have been like a DLC. Like you should have paid like. And they've done this before with Final Fantasy 15's multiplayer with Comrades, right? It was a whole multiplayer DLC that was like $20, and they supported it for like like 2 years basically. And
Wow.
it was great. And I was like, man, and that would have put it on consoles and stuff too. And I'm like, man, if you would have released this, if you would have done the same thing you did with FF15 there, where like one of the few things that FF15 did right was release like a multiplayer DLC, something like that would have really helped Remake, right? Because especially like keeping people like playing the game, keeping people involved in FF7 while they're working on these parts, that would have been such a great way. And it's built on Unreal Engine 4, both the game itself and the First Soldier. So I'm just like,
it also would have just gotten more people to play it.
Yeah.
I think just inherently it being attached to the console would have been like just a smarter move, and whether or not it was like something that people picked up and dropped would be inconsequential at that point, because it was like there, easily accessible, and you're probably gonna play like a couple rounds here and there. Right. And make it a little easier. I know that like mobile gaming is a thing that is like the ultimate like travel system for like a lot of people who develop for it. I just don't see it as being any more convenient unless like the only time I ever get to spend is with my phone and not at home, which makes sense because that's a huge market in other places in the world, but that's just not my life. So it's not as convenient for me to have to stream this game through like another $50 program that is like just as expensive as just buying the fucking game.
Absolutely.
What about Nero and Vice? How do you feel about them? That's where I thought you were gonna just go off like and not really. I actually genuinely didn't know how you were gonna react to that, and I think I was just excited to see. But I am not sure how you feel about the Dirge of Cerberus stuff. So what do you think about that at the end? And is that more or less adding to the experience, removing from the experience? Is that like, did that ruin the game, make it better? And are you excited to see more of that?
Right. Here's my thing, right? Like before this, I was told that this makes Nero and Vice less cringe. And like there's just not enough screen time for either of them for me to agree with that. Like it's just like he kind of shows up and then he's just the final boss. I kind of had the feeling like after I beat him, I was kind of like, was that it?
Yeah, it's like, isn't there more to this than this?
Yeah, like I was kind of like, yo, wait, that was the final boss. Like that was kind of like my.
I remember you saying that. You were like going to the elevator. You're like, oh my god, wait a second, this is it.
Yeah, I was like, wait, this is kind of like. So I actually don't have any opinion on Nero and Vice because they didn't really do anything.
Right. It's pretty weird, and then just like, they just sort of showed up, and you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if they're better or worse than Dirge. I'm sure they can't be worse than Dirge because like a lot of the dialogue and stuff in Dirge was just so legitimately awful. So I'm sure whatever happens, like it won't be as bad as what was originally there. But have they been like completely redeemed and like salvaged as characters? Yeah, whatever they end up doing.
I genuinely just think that they're a broadcast of themselves, just in like a more acceptable format. So like for people who already don't like them and like are seriously just not willing to budge on that, I genuinely think that they're not going to change people. They're not that drastically different to like turn people's heads around. But for people who didn't know the characters or were impartial or didn't really mind them as much, I would say that they're definitely more entertaining in terms of the fact that they actually are just there to like be experienced and then just leave. Like the whole like dragging bodies out of like darkness is like that's still Nero and him being like having like a pain, a love for pain and like being weird about it. Like that's all still like pretty intact. So it's more like being able to get away with even including them in the game and not having it be like a mess, I think, is the success there. Right. And I think almost like kind of in the way that intermission or the base game's ending is sort of like abrasive. I think that's another sort of proof of concept that it's like we can include these things and not have them like ruin the game for you. Like it was a fun boss fight. Both of them are fun boss fights. The music is good. And like they're like, here's how much they care about like Deep Ground is that he's like deep ground and it's supposed to be like a mic drop. And then just like Yuffie's like, cool. Get out of our way, please.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that's sort of all they're meant to do. So I'm actually not shocked that you didn't have like they're not polarizing in any sort of sense in that way.
Right.
So
which I guess you could consider it a success that they are not like the worst thing
ruining
ever.
Actively.
Right. Yeah, actively ruin it. Except for like whenever Nero shows back up, because he definitely is going to. So
that's gonna be the weirdest thing.
Yeah.
I think all of that is gonna happen if they return back to Midgar at any point.
Right.
And it's gonna be this is where my fandom starts to sneak in, and where like NSP is like, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna like this part. But yeah, on the return visit to Midgar might be a good time for those people, or some return visit to Midgar. A good place to include. What if we can actually if the game starts and we can go on to the guest questions, but what if you get into the world map in part 2 and you could just turn around and walk right back to Midgar?
That would be actually be kind of hilarious.
Yeah, you would kind of be like, we could just go back and do this right now.
Yeah.
I'd be so down.
Yeah, that would actually be really interesting, especially if there was like something that you could like do there. Okay, so let's start taking fan questions. I'm scrolling back up a decent ways. Crossy asked, do you think we will touch on things like Genesis' mutiny, the degradation, and the Genesis and Angeal clones?
Me.
Yes. That's more for you.
I think for sure we're going to see Genesis again. And I think we even might... I think with like the whole DLC and the way that they've sort of like presented that and a lot of Before Crisis elements, a lot of that's going to be in my next video of just like, this is how much is already here. And if you're kind of like already on, like not on the page that this is being included in terms of like story elements from the compilation, that's another thing that I would say people need to be prepared for. Like, I think, and controversially, I'll say this, I think Genesis is not nearly as controversial of a character in this game as Zack is. I think people are just like not realizing how big of an impact Zack is going to have on the story comparatively if like Genesis even shows up in a flashback. Like they're not going to be even remotely comparable in terms of like, you know, the effect that they're going to have. And he could be more involved in the story. I'm not really saying how much of that is going to be in there. I just agree completely 100% that we're going to be seeing him in some form or fashion.
For sure. And I think that if it's about tying up loose ends to the compilation, there is no looser end in the compilation than the ending of Dirge of Cerberus. That is the loosest end ever. So if we're gonna tie anything up,
that's a big sigh of relief. Yeah, to hear somebody else say that. I can't tell you, because I mean, as like, you know, like as a teen, like seeing that, like I was like, okay, this is Final Fantasy VII too. Like, what else is it? And then unironically, it has turned out to be Final Fantasy VII 2. Right. I agree. I won't be bitten in the later for this.
Minicrom asking part 1 of the question. Oh boy, I feel like Aerith is a bit of Cassandra in this game. Or Cassandra, am I saying that right? I guess it's like a Greek myth. Cassandra's seeing the future, but nobody believes her. Aerith is like this in the game in the sense that she knows but can't speak otherwise, or she may not be believed. At the end, she has no choice but to speak since she is believed, and they are able to make the decision altogether that creates the unknown. But since it's a bad idea, that could lead to the characters to have to choose between what to change and what not to change. FF7 is partially inspired by Greek tragedy. I think that the real tragedy would be to have Aerith realize it was a mistake, and so we could we easily could have a very different game until Aerith tries to course correct everything and kill. Well, I guess like, you know, like basically create it so that her death ends up happening to her anyway, right?
Right.
That would be proper tragedy. What do you think? Because not killing her would rewrite the last third of the game, which seems to be too much of a task even for Square. That's a pretty interesting question. Thick one too.
Do you want to try that first, or do you want me to take that first?
Sure, because I probably have less to say about it than you do. Because my issue is kind of like, I don't know why they would have any difficulty believing her at this point, right? Because at this point, she can already kind of. She like of course they'd believe her. They walked through the portal that she opened up, and they've only technically
they slayed time itself,
right?
Just for this lady. So
yeah,
they believe in what she's setting out to do,
right? So I feel like if anything, they're kind of like gullible for anything that she's like throwing at them, right? They're kind of not questioning what she says, and so maybe I could like probably like take that perspective more if I felt like they were more like, you know, if they showed any sign of like even like the slightest hinge of doubt, like with Aerith, but like they are like, yeah, they're like, okay, I believe you, like with the portal stuff. And I find that to actually be like somewhat of like, yo, how do you know all this? Explain. You have a lot to elaborate, but they kind of just like, from my expectation,
well,
like,
the whispers come in,
yeah. So
say stop.
That's kind of yeah, and that's kind of like my problem then too. And then like her trying to course correct, like my issue with that is like from a writing perspective is like having a story built around that, like a Steins Gate, like plus or minus, like I get, but like I don't get what that adds to like Final Fantasy VII, right? Like what would that add to like FF7? Like what is that story and what does that add? And while I think you can tell a story about like what you're saying, like very much so, and I think that there actually are stories about that exact thing, like what I need to know is like what does that add in the climax of the story? Like what is the purpose of that in the grander scheme, aside from just like, you know, like a cool fake out?
Sure. And I agree, is that you really can't have this element sticking out so far out that it doesn't have any sort of payoff relevant to not just the story, but you would hopefully have it actually mean something to the characters. Which I would say, not to say any which way or, because again, not really sure, but the one thing that I do sort of see with Aerith, in general, and as opposed to like her journey from the original game, is that the one thing that is very different about those two characters is that there's a certain level of certainty, I feel like, in Aerith's character, in the OG, where she kind of tells like Cloud, like the last time that they speak, even after like he freaks out on her, she's like, I'm gonna go take care of Sephiroth, like I'm gonna go fight Sephiroth, essentially, like don't worry about him, I will take care of him. And like I'm being pulled and compelled to do this, so like there's this feeling taking me to where I need to go, so I'm gonna follow that feeling. And then Sephiroth's like, well, she is a fucking problem, and we need to go take care of that. Right. But the thing is that in Remake, immediately there's this hesitancy to sort of allow herself to fall in line with that. And I think that's something that she doesn't have the strength to do on her own. And the party pulls her to believe that this is the right thing to do, to trust her instincts and maybe go somewhere different with the thing. But I think one of the things that I'm very interested in seeing, and I think one of the reasons that the story is being told this way is that there's a greater pull to like being singular in these characters moving forward. I think that they're going to be facing a lot of stuff that only they can deal with. And one of the things that happens with Aerith in the OG, not to say that this will be repeated, I'm only using it sort of as an example, is that Aerith sort of learns that she's like the last Cetra, and she goes quiet because Cloud is like, well, like, you still have your friends, right? And then she just stops talking to him. Because there's nothing that they can do for her, and she's sort of like sitting there by herself. And I was like, that's the most potent Aerith moment to me, is because she's always being like really happy, very like supportive, and I want to see more of that Aerith come into Remake, I think. And I think if I were to say anything about what I would hope it would do, this inclusion of time and like fate and all of this, and the commitment that they made at the end of part 1, is for it to have a negative and more human repercussion on Aerith's sense of what she like. I put it in this frame because I know a little bit about Final Fantasy X, is that what if Yuna was wrong to believe Titus? Like, right. What if she shouldn't have trusted this new direction to take things in? Right. And what is the repercussion of that then, to have like essentially defied like the thing that you grew up believing, only to find out that it was actually the truth, and that this is the worst outcome? And what does that do to somebody? I'm not saying that that's ultimately what's going to happen, but I would say that if anything bad happens from here, I think Aerith is going to blame herself. And that's not going to be an easy thing for her to take, because I think people think she's a lot stronger than she actually is. She's way weaker. She just can put on a face and endure, but like, how long does that happen? You know what I mean? Like, how many things have to happen before that kind of crumbles away? And it sort of happens in the OG. So I think they'll probably end up going somewhere like that.
Okay, that's a great answer. Great answer. Do you guys think it's possible to see a Genova-controlled Zack in the future, or him being part of the reunion? My answer is no. If anything, Zack's purpose will be to take over Cloud when that stuff happens to him.
I'm gonna be 100% on the same page with with Night Sky Prince on this. Is that Zack has already been proven to not be affected in the most critical of circumstances. Like, the thing that is very clearly stated throughout all of Final Fantasy VII, and has been the most consistent thing about it, is that the characters that have a strong sense of self have a much easier time enduring both the soldier program, which that you get implanted with a small amount of Genova cells in Mako, and it turns you into either a soldier or literally like an out of your mind person who just like, you know, you literally just, you know, Mako poisoning is what you get. And then on top of that, like Sephiroth, Sephiroth copy program. I never can say that seriously because I think that's the strangest way of saying it in the game. But Zack and Cloud both get experimented on, and Zack walks out of it unscathed, and Cloud is a wreck. So yeah, I would say Cloud is the one that you should be worried about more than Zack, 100%, because they've already set up that Cloud is not able to like fend off Sephiroth at all. Like by the end of this, they want to emphasize that Cloud is like the weakest he's in the most vulnerable position he's ever been in, because he's facing, and I'm going to say this for certain, is a Sephiroth that is sort of all encompassing of all of the different versions of Sephiroth. Like, he is the most Sephiroth he has ever been, and also representing his grief. And he is coming at Cloud, who's completely unprepared, full force. And we're just going to be watching that. So I would say keep a close eye out on your boy instead of the random ass Zack, because he's probably going to be filling some shoes in a bit, you know?
Yeah. And I think also that's like how you make Zack playable, right? Because again, a lot of people think that he's just going to be stuck in like a separate timeline like the whole time, and I'm just like, there's no point of that. And that doesn't crescendo, like that doesn't come to any like boiling head or climax. It's just like what's the point of that, right? Yeah, he's just there, for like no reason. And they just,
he's gonna be in the story somewhere, guys, and probably they want to satisfy the itch of Crisis Core. By the way, I know that this was a subject that you guys brought up in your stream, is that Zack differentiating his playstyle DMW. Just give him
that's how I think they'll do it too.
Access. Yeah. So anyway, I hope that answers the question.
How can we expect new players to accept that they can get the sequel to the themes and just have to read up on the original themes and educate themselves on that? So I guess what he's saying is that, what kind of
do you need to play the?
Yeah, do you need to play there to get? Yeah. I'll give my answer.
It's really funny. Oh yeah. Mine is
no.
simple.
Then you go first. Then you go first. Yeah.
Is that I don't think I've ever watched a remake without having seen the original of it first, or been excited for a remake without knowing it first. I think that the audience for most of these are people that are familiar with it, and I'm not saying that you need to play it. I'm just saying is that this is one of the things that I hear a lot about the criticism in terms of like Final Fantasy VII Remake. And it's like, I don't think I've ever watched anything that I haven't already, like Resident Evil Remake 2 and the original. Like I played both of the original games of that first and didn't really have that sort of time. So like, or had any sort of, I guess like better or worse experience for having done that, or like, and I'm not sure if it ruins the experience for anybody else either coming in blind. I've heard there was a poll before that a lot of newer players just were like having a good time. I don't think people think about it that hard if, they're coming in blind. So
yeah,
I think that question only comes up because you're looking at not a grass is greener, but like you do have that experience. So you do have that retrospect, sort of going back to everything we were just talking about with like the references, like some of them are inconsequential,
right?
Yeah. And that stands for the OG too, a little bit. I think everything would be considered fair game at this point. So that's my opinion.
My take is that there was sort of like levels of like understanding to something, right? Like, and I think that like if you take something like Nier Automata or like Final Fantasy 14, like there's like the surface level, like what happened, and I think that you can derive like a lot of meaning behind that. And I think that like if you actually know like the Final Fantasy like lore that like 14, for example, is pulling from like in a certain moment, it becomes like a lot more profound, right? Like you could take Endwalker and Shadowbringers, for example, where you can say, okay, well, Warrior of Light going from Dark Knight back to Paladin is just to show that he went from the Warrior of Darkness and now he's back to the Warrior of Light. But if you know Final Fantasy IV, it's a parallel to Cecil's journey, right? And they're making an homage to like Cecil, and they're using Final Fantasy IV as like the mythos or like the mythology that they're kind of like building that story around, right? So. Or Nier Automata, right, where you can derive a whole bunch of ideas from Nier Automata and understand its themes, even if you don't know like a ton about like all the philosophers that were like hugely important to like creating like Nier's or influencing Nier's story, right? So I think there's that, right? So I think I guess that you could view Remake under a similar lens with understanding the original and the compilation with that. But my problem isn't so much that, like it has to do with the fact of how they approached it. And so executionally, I probably agree with like where you're coming from, like when you ask that question, where I don't feel like it's well done. Obviously Sleepezi disagrees with me on that, but I don't feel that aspect is well done, because I don't feel like a whole bunch of those scenes have any significance or meaning to anyone who has not played that stuff. And I do feel like there isn't like a surface layer like take you can just have on the Arbiters without referencing that material. So in a way, I would conclude differently maybe and say that I do feel like it is to some degree alienating. It's not enough though for people who are just coming in just yet for them to be like, dude, I just don't know what this is, right? So
I would agree with the potential of that not being well explained later.
Yeah.
For sure. I would almost want to say too that like I don't think anybody from the compilation going into Remake was prepared for the whispers or what they were or anything like that. And I think that mystery is supposed to remain that way, because we're sort of like, if you start talking about like maybe it being explained in the future in a more concise way, or like maybe even failing in doing that or succeeding, I think one of the reasons why it is not fully explained is for the mystery of it at the same time, which is not an excuse of it, of effective storytelling in any means, but I had more to reason with that sort of element. I don't think anybody from the compilation would have ever been able to be like, that's exactly, it took people like the whole internet like 3 days, which is like 500 hours of manpower collectively for somebody to find On the Way to a Smile for the first time and be like, there's a book. Read it. So but I think it's still, you know, it, like you said, like, and just in general, like we do get like some of the more essential elements to their use. For the most part, it's just that they're there to defend a timeline, and it seems like that timeline goes to Advent Children. But then again, it's like maybe somebody didn't watch Advent Children, or maybe they don't know what. Here's the other thing: is all those scenes are from Advent Children, but for the most part, they're from the original game. And what we derive from that scene is there's a meteor that is probably going to hit the planet, and Aerith dies or gets gravely injured, and we should probably stop that. So I can't put myself into this position as easily in terms of like deciding for somebody. I'm not saying that you are, but like this is where my head goes is that I can't put myself in the experience of somebody who's playing this for the first time knowing nothing. And I can't bring myself to like make some sort of like, I can't even like, though I answered that question, like I still feel uneasy about it because like I don't know what that feels like to play this game for the first time knowing nothing. So it's like, I would love to one day talk to somebody like in an interview and like pick apart somebody's brain who just didn't play anything. I just like,
I have talked to some people about that, and their big sticking points were Sephiroth and Zack. They were just like, I really just don't get like that, like the guy,
those are fan outcries.
Like people who are like completely blind. They were like, I literally don't get. Now there is something in chat I do want to like respond to from Fallen Angel, who said that if people could unsee the original Final Fantasy VII, they'd view Remake much differently. And he goes on to say, like, you know, OG is like cognitive bias. And the reason I want to reply to that in particular is because it's like a rhetoric that I see a lot in the community. And it's something that I so fundamentally disagree with. This idea that you should see Remake as like a separate thing. The game is deliberately asking you, begging you to actually not. Like, it is begging you to say, hey, please play Final Fantasy VII, and please do like a little digging into the compilation. Like, it is actively asking you to engage with like the pantheon of Final Fantasy VII. So I don't agree with that idea that like, oh yeah, you should just dump the idea of like, you know, or like, you know, you can see the brilliance of Remake by not playing Final Fantasy VII. I think if you really enjoy where they are going with like the whispers and all this stuff, and the fact that they continuously reference the original game, continuously reference the compilation, show you these scenes in there, that the game is like very much wanting you to engage with those things. So to say that you want that, like, you know, they should be like separate, or like you shouldn't, like, you know, if everyone could just forget the OG, they could see like the brilliance of Remake. I disagree with that, right? Like, so much.
Jump in now too, because I want to get in on this because I think that this is something that maybe is overlooked constantly. But it's something that you've already sort of brought up, and it is something that I agree with. Is that you cannot look at Final Fantasy VII Remake, and this is the case with anything attached to any sort of remake, sequel, it is actively pulling and basing a lot of its decisions on everything that came before it. So knowing what I do know and knowing what NSP knows, and like, you can't unsee it because it's baked into the writing of the game by default. Like the scenes, the way that the characters are is all based on the nostalgia of the thing that came before it, and knowing that that's sort of the perspective that this game is obviously being handled to sort of, again, when we say successor, we mean like it is standing on top of the things that came before it to make certain points. Whether or not you know that going into it is inconsequential to first-time players, in my opinion. But to say that it doesn't exist or doesn't deserve or isn't to be criticized or compared to is, in my opinion, not fair, because that's a rigged game. Is because it's including some parts of remake that are the new that nobody really feels comfortable with or like can see as like the you know, where that's heading, and excluding literally everything else that people actually are playing the game for, which are like the characters and everything like that. So like, you can't, the rules of the game are not decided by whether or not this game is a Final Fantasy VII game. Spoiler alert, it is. It has the name, and it deserves the criticism that it gets just by virtue of using those elements of the game. Like, to see it not as a part of it, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be a sequel, and it doesn't have to be a remake. It is a part of the collection of Final Fantasy VII. So you have to, it's just natural for people to look at the original game, one that's regarded as a masterpiece and one of the best games of all time. There was never not going to be any criticism to this game.
100%.
In terms of association to it's literal, the thing that invented it. It doesn't exist literally without it. So I don't see that argument necessarily.
Yeah. I mean,
and it's not,
people
nobody
compare
wants
two
Zack
things.
to live most of the time. Like, I don't think any of us, I've warmed up to the idea because I had to self-evaluate what the priorities of this were for me. And it was something I didn't want to talk about. I tried to talk about it, and then ultimately have just accepted that element is the thing that is the scariest thing that could possibly happen in the game. And that's exactly what it's for. And whether I'm okay or not okay with that is not the point of the game right now. Like, I cannot criticize that until I know exactly what's going on with that. And I don't know what's going on with that. But the other things about the game have proven to me that they could probably swing this, and I will probably be okay. But to say that just because we're accepting of something does not mean that we're head over heels in love with it. The point of the game is to not make you feel positively or reassured. So I don't like, and art does not have to reassure you either, which I think is one of the things that is concerning me about this, is people just feel overly reassured by the ending, when it's like, that's literally not what the game is telling you to be.
Yeah.
So to say that and think that is not accurate, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
100%. Like, we're in complete agreement there. We're gonna take like 3 big questions just so that we don't go like crazy over time. Yeah, because we honestly can vibe about this like all damn day. So
by the way,
and I do probably want this one to go on YouTube. So go on. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, just because I have like any sort of critical opinion about any of the things being brought up does not mean that I'm trying to sway your opinion in chat. Or NSP and I are on the same page, and I'm not reading chat right now. Admittedly, I'm not looking at it. Whoa, that was a big gust of wind. And whispers.
Oh man,
get out of here.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway,
I'm surprised they're not coming for me.
Are you serious?
Is that wind slamming? I like hear something slamming.
Yeah. This is so unusual. I'm gonna go lock my front door really quick.
The whispers are definitely coming. Wow. I'm seeing some of the big questions I wanna ask. There's
weird, dude. It's like fucking I'm about to get whisked away into like fucking, the land of Oz or some shit.
Oh anyway. Man. Okay. So let's get to the 3 big questions. We got one from Crossy. So, how do you guys think the Whispers works? It's a good question. I don't know. Specifically, I'm talking about Zack being alive. We know those events take place weeks or months prior to the events of Midgar. So why did the Whispers from months prior suddenly stop keeping fate true? Why so selective? Surely if defeating them under the influence entirely, then all things should have been intervened, but it should be undone, including Barrett being revived, etc. Yeah, that's a good point, right? Like, if the Whispers disappear from all points in time, then, like, why is it that Zack is revived, but when Barrett was stabbed, he's not? And the only answer,
why doesn't he magically just disappear?
Right, like, yeah,
and
like
fade away.
Yeah, like, and the only logical answer I have is, they were in the singularity. They were outside of history being rewritten, and so they're coming into an unknown world in a sense. That's like,
I would actually agree with that statement specifically because the bubble that is created is very clearly sort of the separation between one reality and the other.
Right.
Like one point and another, and which is why when they cross paths at that point where there should be something stopping both one from getting, this is something I say in my video, is the barrier is not just for the people who are trying to leave, it's for the other people to get in. So like whatever happens, they don't want any of these two things to happen. They don't want the party to leave Midgar. They don't want Zack to enter Midgar, and which is where we see him in the DLC afterwards. So I think for the most part, that's how I see it. Is that the singularity sort of like redirects this whole situation so that all of the party exists here at this moment. And then everything else has sort of shifted. Something has shifted around them, hence why the terrier bag is a big deal. It's like, oh, like even as something as small as a chip bag mascot.
Right, yeah.
So
they rebrand it, bro. That's all it is. They just rebrand it. Like when Zack died, they were like,
as soon as they saw that Whisper Harbinger, they were like, I feel
yeah. Oh my god!
I can take a pen to this beagle.
And I think this also answers Cloud OGA's question at the same time too, because he asked if Zack is alive and in the same timeline, where is the wounded and poisoned Cloud? Did Zack bring him along to Midgar, or did he forget him with Aerith in mind? No. Like, actually, all that stuff actually happened, right? And
so that's where the weirdness sort of sets in.
Right. Because all
that it wasn't weird before.
Right. And that's where like part of the mystery is going to be of like part 2, is that all that stuff happened from Zack's perspective. And that's what's weird about it. We
never saw what Cloud saw in that situation from the perspective of him afterwards. Meaning like we never saw Cloud thinking back to when Zack was murdered. The only thing we ever see Cloud respond to is the name being mentioned and all of those usual triggers that like trigger a memory, but we actually never see the thing. And we actually know for a fact that the scene that we see Zack in is not a memory of Cloud's necessarily, or it could be anything else, even though they use the same effect of it. So it is not a scene representing something inside of Cloud's mind. It is some other thing, which is most likely, in layman's terms, like a point in time that is being directly affected by the actions that are taking place in that moment. Whether or not that's purposeful or not, or just a some sort of accidental occurrence is completely theoretical.
Yeah. And that's kind of how I perceive it too. So like people will kind of ask like, oh, like why is there 2 Buster Swords and all those sorts of things. But I don't think that like, I think that like when you think about how this happens, like it's not that complicated. Like why is there 2 Buster Swords? Then like you also have to ask like, why is there a Midgar HQ that Sephiroth like throws at you and then you slice through it? That's the same reason there's 2 Buster Swords.
Train.
Yeah.
Where did that train?
Yeah.
Where's the debris?
They basically destroy Midgar, actually.
Yes.
In the entire fight of the ending of the game. And like,
yes.
And like, no one talks about that. But then like the moment you mention this stuff, people ask like, why is there 2 Buster Swords? What you should ask is that is why was there a Midgar that was completely destroyed? And then you get out of there and Midgar is fine. That's the answer. Like that's like the type of like time dynamic that we're dealing with. Is that convoluted? I think it's gonna be for a lot of people. Now, is it for me? I do have an intuitive sense on it, but I do think that like a lot of people are like, yo, I don't get this at all.
I think it will definitely have a moment to itself, regardless of how much people get or don't. I think there's going to be a point in the game that pretty much goes into it. So whether I think people are necessarily 100% aware of like how the timeline works, they're going to need to at some point throw that back in to something or talk about it in some capacity. Because again, as we sort of stated, as like at least like there's a setup and payoff element to a lot of this stuff, and that would need some form of explanation as to like give people like a standing, whether that's done through the chip bag or not, or the stamps or whatever is like kind of up in the air, but probably that. So whatever, there will be an explanation is what I think guarantee, or I'm super confident on.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. And I think that like all those types of questions that you're asked, like I think that the characters will ask that themselves in the game, and that'll be their way to expound upon that. The Hylian, hello. Do you think Sonon returns, and if so, how? Yeah, he's gonna be a heartless for sure, like Sleepezi was saying. No, he's gonna return in some way, and it'll have something to do with Nero. I don't know. Yeah,
I will say Nero is the best explanation for that. Simply just because that's where we see him go, and there's a lot of he will be coming back because that's what the ending sets up. The ending sets up for another payoff to that story for some reason, and that will happen. We just don't know how, but how he would come back. Nero's darkness works in the way that once he pulls something in, he takes something from whatever, even if it escapes. So what he pulls in is Sonon, and he's taking something from him, which, if this is DOC lore. The essential takeaways is that he could very, very easily be taking something to use later that is a part of Sonon. That's how I see it being used, which is essentially, as everybody already knows, like a very heartless thing to do, which is why I joke about it, is that I genuinely think that Nero's going to show up using Sonon's abilities as a way of like, that's what he took, is some sort of ninja-like ability, which sounds ridiculous. And the other ridiculous factor is just Sonon showing up, period, for me. Like, I think that's a very awkward thing to do. That's one thing I'm just like, I didn't like that character enough for him to come back. You could have just gotten rid of him, and I think I would have been okay. But
yeah.
I'm interested to see, because if it's more of a redirect back into DOC lore, Dirge of Cerberus lore, I'd be like super stoked. And that is inherently like a clusterfuck. So I think they should lean into that if they ever show up again and make it really silly. Anyway.
Yeah,
That's my answer.
100%. That's how I'm feeling. Okay, I think we knocked out like most of the good user questions. Wow, thank you guys so much for providing. You guys had like some really good questions to ask. Actually, hold on. Before we wrap this out. Actually, I kind of want to like touch on this one because this is actually kind of interesting. And I actually meant to ask you this. I don't think we ever got around to this. Why do you think the whispers we see in the... Well, actually, wait, I'm not sure if he's actually asking this the way I thought I was going to ask it. Because I was going to ask, like, why do we see the whispers, like, with Zack? That was what I was going to ask. But he's asking, why do we see whispers in a battle simulation 30 years prior to the original game?
Yeah, he's talking about First Soldier, because the whispers show up in
do
First
they?
Soldier. Yeah, they do.
What? Okay.
They show up in a simulation, which is what that is.
Oh.
And their field map, and that's how you fight Cloud. Is you fight Cloud in a bubble, of a whisper bubble, sort of in the same way that we fought. And he has like one glowing red eye, sort of in the same way that Kadaj has that representation in the Whisper of Beardy. It's pretty much the same context. Obviously, they don't have the budget, I'm imagining, so they just like turned Cloud into a Heartless and just gave him like one red shining eye and then just called it a day.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that that's what that's supposed to be a reference to, is a bubble in time, and they call it a disturbance. There's some sort of disturbance on the field map, and you're tasked to go check it out. I genuinely am not really sure about that yet. But I will say that the parallels there are very distinct, as like, here's something that is a pocket in time that isn't affecting the rest of the story, where you can interact with this thing that is referencing a future event. Because you have to think, right? Like, Cloud isn't even around by the point that First Soldier is happening. So he's being taken and put in front of them, most likely to do the same thing that Whisper Beardy and the rest of the Harbingers were put in front of the other ones to do, which is to protect the timeline from something happening. These are all assumptions. I'm not saying this is truth. These are just observations that I'm making. So I would say that there's something to do with it, like extending that lore to maybe comment on that later, when we maybe get more information about like what the Whisper Harbinger was, what we fought, what we averted, what was responsible for that stuff. So that's my takeaway.
Weird.
You should go look at footage.
Weird, because I was thinking that, like, you know, given like the conventional conjecture on the whispers, that that they're kind of like a result of like Cloud and Sephiroth's appearance, or like, not Cloud and Aerith and Sephiroth like fooling with stuff, right? Like, I was like, oh, okay. But now, and then I thought, like, wait, they appear as far back as when Zack was still alive. And now I'm hearing that they appear as far back as 30 years ago. As
the discovery of Genova.
So it's like, So...
Yeah, Hylian, you're asking if First Soldier is canon? Yes. For the most part, it has a story inside of it that is being told. It's not being told as, like, that's not the forefront of the game. But there is a story that's happening, and that's one of the secret surprises of that. But yeah, the events of it are also technically canon. It just the inconsequential canon, sort of how you can see it. It's just a simulated battle. Like, there's no consequence to it, but there's something maybe in there that is. Who the fuck knows? It might be something that we figure out later, or they just are just doing it for funsies. You know, maybe.
That's weird, because that throws a lot of forks into like what you perceive. And this is like why, like, I'm like, the arbiters are not a straightforward concept to me. Yeah.
No, well, here's the
Yeah.
thing, and here's the beauty of it is that like you didn't know about that 5 seconds ago, and you were totally on board. So don't worry about it. And they still are doing the same shit.
But
Yeah, you are. Anyway, thanks for the stream.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But this is a good point to like wrap up, and I've been giving some things to consider now. Sleepezi, man. Wow, thank you so much for coming on here. Do you have anything that you want to plug before we close the stream out, man?
First of all, thank you so fucking much for having me on.
Oh,
I've
of course.
been seriously addicted to like just watching the streams back and watching them live and everything, and it's been just more fun than I can tell you. So I appreciate you as a person and your opinions and your ideas, and also just your content that you're putting out on a daily basis. The grind is real, and this is the real deal, guys. Plugging, I would say my YouTube channel, Sleepezi, at youtube.com. You would check that out. I would really appreciate it. A lot of fun things to think about, even if you're not necessarily super sold on the theory. I can tell you right now that you will definitely learn a lot about the compilation and some of this extended lore in the most entertaining way and informative way that I can possibly make it. They're long, so if you need something for the ride, just put it on. I'm also playing through Final Fantasy VII OG with a 60 FPS mod attached to it right now, discussing those elements as well, doing a slow playthrough, talking about the compilation, talking about the original story, talking about Remake, and it looks beautiful. So if you haven't seen the game in 60 FPS with like all the models and stuff, it's amazing. Shout outs to Sunamods for that. And the other thing is, if you want to learn more about the game and just talk about it, it's an opening environment, whether you like it or not, come hang out. That's it.
Awesome. And if this ends up making its way to YouTube, it probably will, because this was some good content. The links to all that is gonna be in the description below. So thank you guys so much. We're gonna be back on Monday. I have to fight Hell House on hard mode. I'm preparing to get my cheeks clap. If you haven't hit the follow button, please be sure to do so right now, because that way you can see me humiliate myself in front of everyone when Hell House completely destroys me.
Which was a fun match, by the way, already.
Yeah.
By the way, congratulations on partner as well. I want to make sure that I say that publicly and privately.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well deserved, my friend. I'm super happy for you. So
I appreciate it. Man, it was a grind, man. I'm glad we're finally here, though.
You're there.
Yes, we are.
Support your boys.
Yes. All right. We are raiding Suna. Thank you so much, Sleepezi. Thank you, chat. Love you guys so much, and I will see you all on Monday. Later.